The marshmallow that waited. What if your entire future could be predicted by one sweet, fluffy decision? A room, a child, a marshmallow placed carefully on a table, and a gentle voice that says, "If you wait and don't eat it, I'll give you another one when I return." Then silence. This was the setup of one of the most famous and deceptively innocent psychological experiments ever conducted, known as the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment. It was first led by psychologist Walter Mischel in the 1960s. At first glance, it looks like a simple test of patience, but the results suggested something far deeper, that a child's ability to delay gratification might predict their success decades later. Children sat alone in a room with the marshmallow. Some stared at it. Some played games to distract themselves. Others gave in and took a bite. The longer they waited, the more self-control they were believed to possess. Years later, researchers followed up. The children who had waited longer were reportedly more successful in school, healthier, and even had better relationships. But here's the twist that makes it worth our attention tonight. Decades later, critics pointed out a troubling flaw. Most of the children who succeeded came from more stable, wealthier families. What if the experiment wasn't measuring self-control, but trust? What if those who ate the marshmallow early weren't impulsive, but simply unsure if adults keep their promises? A child who has grown up in scarcity may not gamble on future rewards, because when food is uncertain, waiting doesn't feel wise. It feels dangerous. The marshmallow test, in this light, becomes a quiet mirror of inequality. What began as a cute experiment became a symbol of how environment shapes behavior more than willpower does. The myth of the self-made child crumbles under closer inspection. Think of your own life. How many times were you told that waiting was good, that discipline would pay off, only to find that the reward never came? And how many decisions were labeled as impatience when they were really just self-preservation? The marshmallow waited. So did the child, and in that waiting, we glimpse something sacred and sad. How even simple experiments can echo the quiet struggles of being human. So tonight, remember, not every choice is about willpower. Sometimes it's about what the world has taught us to expect, and the soft sweetness of trust, like the marshmallow, doesn't always last long enough to wait for. The lost boy who was never told. What if your identity was given to you by a lie? In the quiet corridors of psychological history, there is a story not whispered enough. The story of David Reimer, once known as John Joan, whose life was shaped by an experiment that sought to rewrite human nature. It began with an accident. In 1966, during a routine circumcision in Canada, baby David's penis was severely damaged. His parents, desperate and devastated, sought help. Enter Dr. John Money, a renowned sexologist at Johns Hopkins University. He had a theory. Gender identity was not innate, but learned. If raised as a girl, David could become one. So they tried. David was renamed Brenda, dressed in dresses, told she was a girl. Dr. Money declared the case a success, even publishing glowing reports. But behind the academic applause, a child was quietly unraveling. Brenda didn't feel like a girl. She rejected dolls, fought against femininity, and suffered in silence, believing something was deeply wrong. Not with the experiment, but with herself. By adolescence, Brenda was suicidal. That's when her parents finally told her the truth. And in that truth, David reclaimed his identity. He transitioned back to living as a boy, choosing the name David to reflect a sense of rebirth, like the biblical figure who faced giants. But the trauma lingered. The experiment that tried to reshape him left wounds too deep. David later married and tried to build a life, but the shadows of manipulation never fully left. In 2004, at the age of 38, he died by suicide. This was not just an experiment gone wrong. It was an ethical collapse. Dr. Money's belief that identity could be engineered ignored something quiet and unchangeable inside us. A sense of self that resists labels, that cannot be dressed up or renamed without consequence. David's story reminds us that even the most intelligent theories can be devastating when tested on the living, without consent, without pause. Imagine being told who you are by people in white coats. Imagine not being believed when your soul quietly says, "That's not me." This isn't just about gender or science. It's about the dangerous arrogance of trying to fix what was never broken, about the silence that follows when we treat humans as hypotheses. And so tonight, as your thoughts slow and sleep nears, let David's story gently linger. Not every scar is visible. Not every experiment deserves applause. And not every truth can be overwritten. Even with good intentions, the prisoners who forgot it was a game. What happens when we pretend too well? In the summer of 1971, the basement of Stanford University's psychology building was turned into something it was never meant to be, a prison. Not a real one, but close. Enough to become dangerous. This was the Stanford prison experiment, led by psychologist Philip Zimbardo. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. Volunteers were assigned randomly. Half would play the role of guards, the other half, prisoners. All were ordinary young men, college students, healthy, educated, willing, but the roles changed them. The guards began to assert dominance. They used psychological tactics, insults, sleep deprivation. The prisoners, their peers just days before, broke down. Some cried, some rebelled, some fell silent. In just a few days, the experiment spiraled, out of control. Zimbardo, playing the role of prison superintendent, watched it unfold without intervening. It wasn't until an outside observer, horrified by what she saw, urged him to stop, that the experiment ended on day 6. What this study revealed wasn't just about prisons. It was about people. How quickly we become what the system expects us to be. How easily uniforms and roles, even when we know they're fake, begin to feel real. There were no criminals, no true authority, just suggestion and surrender. Zimbardo later argued that it proved how environments shape behavior, that good people, placed in bad systems, can become cruel, but others have questioned the ethics. Did the guards truly act naturally? Or were they encouraged to be harsh? Was it really an experiment? Or just a performance that went too far? Still, the echo remains. Think of your own life. Have you ever acted colder just because you were expected to be strong? Played a role at work, at school, in a relationship, and started to lose sight of where the mask ends and the real you begins? The Stanford prison experiment wasn't just about college kids in costumes. It was a mirror for something quieter and scarier, the ease with which we forget ourselves. So tonight, as your eyes begin to rest, let this be your reminder. You are not your title, not your role, not your costume. And no matter how strong the walls feel around you, you were never meant to live in someone else's prison. The obedience that shocked the world. Would you hurt someone just because a man in a lab coat told you to? That's the question Stanley Milgram posed in 1961. Not with a speech, but with a switch. A machine with levers labeled from 15 volts to 450. Words like slight shock, danger, severe shock, and finally, XXX. The setup was simple, yet chilling. A participant, the teacher, was instructed to administer electric shocks to another person. The learner, each time they answered a question incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the teacher didn't know that. The learner, hidden in another room, was an actor. The screams, the pleas, the eventual silence. All scripted, but the teacher's reactions were real, and so was the pressure. A calm man in a white lab coat stood by, saying only, "Please continue." If the teacher hesitated, he repeated it, not forcefully, just persistently, and most obeyed. Despite their discomfort, despite the cries, despite their own shaking hands, over 65% of participants delivered what they believed was a potentially lethal shock. Simply because they were told to, Milgram's experiment became one of the most famous in psychology, sparking debate around ethics, authority, and the fragile boundary between personal conscience and obedience. People wondered, were these participants evil, weak, or just human? The truth is sobering. We are wired to trust authority. In childhood, we learn to listen to parents, teachers, doctors. That trust can save lives, but it can also be exploited. When rules override empathy and uniforms override morality, we begin to follow, not because we agree, but because we're afraid not to. The Milgram experiment showed us not how cruel people are, but how compliant, and maybe that's more frightening. Imagine being in that room, hearing someone scream, being told gently that you have no choice. What would you do? It's easy to say, "I'd walk away." But pressure doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. So as you drift into stillness tonight, let this linger in your mind. Kindness is strongest when it resists command. And the most courageous word in any language is simply no. The boy in the bubble of silence. Can a child grow without touch, without warmth, without a single word? In the 1940s, Austrian-American psychoanalyst René Spitz studied infants in orphanages and found something unsettling. These babies had food. They had clean beds, medical care, but they did not have love. No mother's arms, no laughter, no soft voices, only routine, sterility, and silence. And they began to fade. This was not a formal experiment at first, but an observation. Still, the findings shaped decades of understanding and misunderstanding of early childhood psychology. Spitz recorded the regression of these babies. How those who were once responsive, smiling, cooing, became listless, motionless, quiet. How some stopped eating, how some died. It wasn't hunger of the body, it was emotional starvation. He called it hospitalism. Today, we might call it neglect or deprivation, but the core truth remains the same. Without affection, we shrink. We may survive, but we do not grow. This wasn't just an orphanage problem. It became a chilling metaphor for what happens when we strip away the very things that make us human: connection, care, voice, and presence. Later studies would show that even brief periods of maternal separation could change brain development, alter hormones, leave imprints that echo across a lifetime. The irony? These institutions believed they were protecting the children from germs, from over-attachment, from chaos. In reality, they created sterile rooms where silence killed more slowly than disease ever could. And it wasn't just babies. We all carry a need for presence, someone to notice our joy, witness our pain, hold our fear without fixing it. We are not just thinkers or machines. We are stories that long to be heard. You don't need to be in an orphanage to feel the ache of absence. A quiet home, a loveless marriage, a life lived in the margins of someone else's attention. So tonight, as the world grows still, Remember this: being seen is not a luxury. It is breath. It is life. And even the quietest child, even you, deserves a voice to echo back, a soft hand to say, "I see you. I'm here." The monster behind the mirror. What happens when the one meant to protect you turns on you instead? In 1939, long before ethics committees guarded the boundaries of psychological research, a quiet and devastating study was carried out at the University of Iowa. It came to be known, chillingly, as the Monster Study. The lead researcher was Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist and psychologist who had once struggled with stuttering himself. He believed that stuttering was not just a physical problem, but could also be shaped, or even caused, by how children were treated when they spoke. So he designed a study, but not with volunteers, with orphans. 22 children from an Ahazan, Iowa orphanage were divided into two groups. One group was given positive speech therapy, praised for speaking clearly, reassured when they stumbled. The other group, the experimental one, was given harsh negative feedback, told their speech was poor, even when it wasn't. Their normal hesitations were labeled as stuttering. The goal: to see if stuttering could be induced in children who didn't have it, and the result: some of those in the negative group did begin to stutter. Others developed deep anxiety around speaking. Some fell silent altogether, their confidence shattered, not by nature, but by suggestion. The experiment caused no physical pain, but it left emotional scars, lasting ones. The name Monster Study didn't come from Johnson himself, but from his colleagues. Horrified by the implications, these were not numbers on a chart. These were children, vulnerable, voiceless, and misled. The study remained buried for decades, its results unpublished until long after. But when it resurfaced, it became a powerful symbol of how dangerous ideas become when applied to the powerless. Think of this: how many of us carry wounds from words spoken long ago? You're too slow. You always mess up. You're not good enough. We think of experiments as things done in labs, but sometimes they happen in classrooms, in families, in the mirror. A single belief, repeated, becomes a truth. A truth, lived long enough, becomes a cage. And so tonight, as silence wraps around you like a warm sheet, let your breath gently undo what fear once whispered. You are not broken. You were simply misnamed. And the voice that matters most now is the one you reclaim for yourself. The twins who never knew. What if you spent your whole life feeling incomplete because someone made you that way on purpose? Between the 1960s and 1980s, a secret psychological study unfolded behind the innocent walls of adoption agencies in New York. A study so hidden, so methodical, that the participants didn't even know they were part of it. At the center of this story were twins, and in some cases, triplets, who were deliberately separated at birth. Their names, their parents, their lives, all split without warning, all in the name of science. Led by psychiatrist Dr. Peter Neubauer, this project aimed to answer a dark question: is personality shaped more by nature or nurture? To find out, identical siblings were placed into different homes. One affluent, one middle class, one working class, and observed for years. But the adoptive families were never told the full truth. They had no idea their child had a sibling, living a parallel life, sometimes just a few miles away. The children were visited regularly by researchers, given cognitive tests, filmed during play. All the while, their emotional pain, the subtle sense that something was missing, went unacknowledged. It wasn't until years later, sometimes through sheer coincidence, that the siblings met. In one famous case, documented in 3 identical strangers, triplets reunited in adulthood, discovering they had lived nearly identical early lives despite being raised apart. But the reunion brought more than joy. It brought confusion, grief, rage. Why had they been separated? Why hadn't anyone told them? And most haunting of all, what had been done in the name of research, and what was lost because of it? The study's findings were never fully published. The data, sealed until 2066, remains locked in archives. Even now, the truth is incomplete, the damage irreversible. This wasn't just a question of science. It was a theft, of family, of identity, of choice. Imagine growing up never knowing that your loneliness had a twin, that your deepest questions had a face, and that someone decided you didn't deserve to meet it. So tonight, as you settle deeper into quiet, remember this. You are more than a subject, more than a variable, more than someone's theory, and, even when the pages are sealed, the heart remembers what was torn away, the bond, the longing, the mirror that always knew there was more, the dolls that reflected America. Can a toy tell the truth about a nation's soul? In the 1940s, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted a quiet but groundbreaking study using something simple, dolls. They were identical in every way, except one. One doll had white skin, the other black. The experiment was offered to children, most of them African American, in segregated schools across the United States. Each child was asked questions. Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which one looks like you? The results were heartbreaking. Most of the children, even the black children, attributed positive traits to the white doll. They called it nice, smart, pretty. The black doll, they said, was bad, ugly, dirty, and when asked which doll looked like them, many paused, then pointed to the black doll, but with sadness, with shame. What the Clarks had revealed wasn't just childhood preference. They had unearthed the internalized consequences of racism. How societal messages, segregation, and discrimination were shaping even the youngest minds. These weren't just opinions. They were reflections of wounds too deep for words. This experiment would go on to play a powerful role in Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case that ruled racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. The Clarks' research was cited as proof that separate was not equal, that even in play, injustice leaves its mark. But beyond the courtrooms and headlines, something even deeper lingers. Children don't invent hate, they absorb it, from systems, from silence, from the way the world looks at them, or refuses to look at all. Think about how we all carry versions of those dolls inside us, which parts of ourselves we learned to love, which we were taught to hide. How many of us have believed quietly that our reflection was the bad one because someone else said so? The doll test didn't just reflect children. It reflected society, and it still does. So tonight, as shadows lengthen and thoughts soften, remember, your worth was never in your skin or in what others chose to praise or reject. You were always more than someone's bias and the child within. You, the one who pointed quietly at the doll, deserves to be told, you are beautiful, you are enough. You were never the broken one. The eyes that couldn't look away. What happens when you're told someone deserves pain and you start to believe it? In the late 1960s, psychologist Albert Bandura conducted a series of experiments that might seem simple on the surface, but revealed something deeply unsettling about human nature. Our ability to justify harm through labels, distance, and language. Participants were brought in to administer supposed electric shocks to someone else, much like in Milgram's study. But Bandura added one new twist: dehumanization. Before the shock task began, some participants overheard the victim being described in neutral terms. Others heard them referred to as an animal or a bunch of rotten people. Just those words. Just a whisper of judgment, a label. The result: those who heard the dehumanizing phrases administered significantly higher levels of shock, not because they were cruel, but because something inside had been softened. Not their heart, but their hesitation. By changing the story, the guilt was dulled. It was one of the earliest experiments to show how language changes empathy. When we frame someone as less than, hurting them feels justified. It's how soldiers are trained, how bullies are excused, how cruelty gets permission, and it happens far more quietly than we realize. Think of how we talk about people we disagree with, online, in politics, on the news. Thugs, monsters, illegals, failures. These aren't just words, they're switches. And once flipped, we stop seeing people and start seeing targets. Even children absorb this. Bandura would later go on to develop the social learning theory. The idea that we learn not just from what happens to us, but from what we see others do. If a child watches someone hurt and sees no consequence, they learn that harm is allowed. If they hear someone called worthless, they start to believe it. We are mirrors, we are sponges, and we are storytellers. The moment we stop telling the story of someone's humanity, we open the door to hurt them. So tonight, let your mind rest, not in judgment, but in softness. Because every face carries its own quiet story, and every word we use to reduce someone tells the world who we really are. Choose the words that build bridges, not cages. Even when it's easier to look away. The man who watched a murder and did nothing. If everyone sees the crime, why does no one stop it? In 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her apartment building in Queens, New York. The attack was brutal, drawn out, and, according to reports at the time, witnessed by 38 people, 38 neighbors, 38 silent windows. No one called the police. No one came outside. Not until it was far too late. This story sent shockwaves through America. How could an entire community remain frozen while a woman begged for her life? The press called it urban apathy, a symptom of modern life. But psychologists saw something deeper. From this tragedy, researchers Bibb Latané and John Darley studied what would later become known as the Bystander Effect, the tendency for individuals to not offer help when others are present. It's not that people don't care, it's that when we're in a group, we assume someone else will act. We diffuse responsibility. We wait for a signal. We look to others and say nothing. And when everyone does that, no one does anything. Later investigations would reveal that the original reports of the Kitty Genovese case were exaggerated. Some neighbors did call. Some didn't understand what was happening. But the core phenomenon remained that in a crowd, silence can become contagious. And that silence costs lives. The bystander effect isn't limited to emergencies. It shows up when a classmate is bullied, when a colleague is harassed, when a stranger is crying on the train. The thought crosses your mind, should I do something? And just as quickly, someone else probably will. But what if you are that someone? What if the difference between a life lost and a life saved is one voice, one hand reaching forward? We're taught to mind our business, to keep walking, to avoid risk. But sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply not looking away. So, as the world quiets around you tonight, think of this. Kindness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just the sound of a door opening, a phone dialing, a voice saying, "Are you okay?" And in that moment, you are no longer a bystander. You are the reason someone was not alone. The teacher who lied to her class. Can a lesson be too powerful to forget? In 1968, the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, a third-grade teacher named Jane Elliott stood before her all-white classroom in Riceville, Iowa, and asked a question no textbook could answer. What does it feel like to be discriminated against just because of how you look? And so, she designed an experiment, not in a lab, but in her classroom. She divided her students by eye color. On the first day, blue-eyed children were told they were smarter, cleaner, better. They were given extra privileges. More recess time, front seats in class. The brown-eyed children were told they were lazy, forgetful, inferior. They had to wear collars, so everyone could see who they were. The results were immediate and disturbing. Blue-eyed children began to mock their brown-eyed peers. Some refused to play with them. Others bragged. Test scores from the inferior group dropped. Tears fell. Fights broke out, all in a matter of hours. The next day, Elliot reversed the roles. Now the brown-eyed children were superior, and the blue-eyed ones were less than. And the same pattern repeated. Only this time, the other side held the power. In just 2 days, the class had absorbed the rules of prejudice. Jane Elliott later explained that her students weren't bad. They were simply obedient to a system, even a fake one, and once labeled, they lived up to those expectations, for better or worse. The experiment, controversial even now, forced children to feel what racism couldn't be taught in words. Some say it was too harsh. Others say it changed them forever. And isn't that what discrimination does in the real world? It's not always loud. It's in glances, assumptions, dividing lines drawn in silence. And the longer the roles stay fixed, the more they begin to feel natural, even deserved. Think of your own experience. Were you ever labeled too dark, too quiet, too loud, too foreign? Or maybe, were you ever given invisible advantages you didn't ask for, but quietly accepted? So tonight, as you lie in the dark with nothing to prove, let this thought rest beside you. The lines we draw around each other are not real, and the worth you carry in your eyes has nothing to do with their color. You are not above, you are not below, you are simply human. The classroom that turned into a cult. How far can a lesson go before it becomes something else? In 1967, at a high school in Palo Alto, California, a history teacher named Ron Jones faced a challenge. His students couldn't understand how ordinary Germans had followed the Nazi regime. They wouldn't have gone along with it. The students insisted. Not us, not here. So, Jones decided to show them. He started something called the third wave. It began with discipline. Chairs had to be straight. Answers given sharply. No slouching. Then came slogans. Strength through discipline. Strength through community. Students were given membership cards, secret salutes, roles. Those who followed the rules were rewarded. Those who didn't, shunned. By the third day, the class had tripled in size. Students recruited others, eager to belong to something. They snitched on classmates. They stood straighter, spoke less, thought less. The experiment had become a movement. Jones hadn't expected it to work so well, but he watched, stunned, as his students transformed before him. It wasn't fear that fueled them. It was pride, belonging, a sense of purpose. On the final day, he revealed the truth. There was no third wave. It had all been a fabrication. The students sat in silence as he played footage of Nazi rallies. Some cried. Some were ashamed. Others were angry. Not at the lie, but at how easily they believed. What makes this story so haunting isn't just how quickly a classroom turned. It's how good the students felt while it happened. We often imagine totalitarianism as something imposed, forced by tanks and tyrants. But sometimes it arrives as a comfort, a place to belong, a rhythm to follow. And little by little, we trade thinking for obedience, doubt for unity, freedom for belonging. It doesn't take evil to create control, just rules, and silence, and someone to say, "This is how we do things here." Think of the systems you've been part of. A school, a job, a group. Have you ever felt yourself slipping into a role simply because everyone else was? The third wave lasted only 5 days, but the memory lasted a lifetime. So tonight, as your mind grows still, remember this: even the softest tide can become a wave. Question what feels too easy, and never be afraid to stand alone, especially when everyone else is marching in rhythm. The line you swore was longer, "Can your eyes lie to you if everyone else insists they're telling the truth?" In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch designed a study that seemed almost too simple. It was about lines. Literally, participants were shown a card with one line on it, then another card with 3 lines of different lengths. Their task: point out which line matched the first one. Easy, right? Except most of the participants were actors. In on the experiment, only one person in the room was unaware, and as the group gave obviously wrong answers, the real participant often followed along, even when the truth was clear, even when their own eyes disagreed. Again and again, people went along with the crowd. Some later said they genuinely started to doubt themselves. Others admitted they didn't want to stand out or be the one to cause conflict, but the result was chilling. Around 75% of participants gave at least one wrong answer just to fit in. This is called conformity, the quiet pressure to agree, to belong, to not disrupt. And it doesn't just happen in labs. It happens in classrooms, in boardrooms, in friend circles. We adjust our truth to match the room, even when it shrinks us, even when it hurts. Asch's experiment revealed something delicate. That truth is not just about what we see. It's about what we're willing to defend in a room full of people who see differently. Think of the moments you stayed silent when something felt wrong, laughed at a joke you didn't find funny, agreed with an idea just to keep peace. Were you lying to them or to yourself? The power of Asch's work lies not in deception, but in reflection. We don't change our beliefs because we're weak. We do it because we're wired to belong, to stay safe, to avoid rejection, but safety too has a cost. So tonight, in this soft space of honesty, ask yourself, what truths have you set aside to stay small? What lines have you agreed with that never really matched? And when the world feels louder than your instincts, pause and trust your own eyes, because even in silence, truth deserves one voice, yours. The baby who cried and no one cared. What happens to a mind when comfort never comes? In 1975, psychologist Edward Tronick performed a hauntingly simple experiment, now known as the still face experiment. It involved only a mother and her baby, sitting face to face. First, the mother interacted normally, smiling, cooing, responding. The baby lit up with joy, waving arms, making sounds, locking eyes with the person they trusted most. Then, on cue, the mother froze. No smile, no sound, just a blank, motionless face. And in just a few seconds, the baby's expression began to change. First, confusion, then reaching, Then distress. The baby tried everything. Smiling, pointing, crying, to get the mother to respond. But she didn't. And within a minute, the baby started to collapse inward, pulling away, turning the head, falling into a quiet despair that seemed too heavy for someone so small. After the mother resumed interaction, the baby slowly recovered, but the moment lingered. This experiment showed something we rarely name. We need to be seen, not just for survival, but for sanity. When someone we depend on becomes emotionally unavailable, even temporarily, it disturbs our entire system. And while the study used infants, the lesson applies across life. Think of the partner who goes silent during conflict, the friend who withdraws without a word, the parent who never responded when you needed them most. Emotional unavailability is not always loud. Sometimes it's a still face, a cold shoulder, a delayed text, a blank stare that leaves you wondering if you were too much or never enough. The still face experiment reminds us that connection isn't just a luxury, it's oxygen. We learn to regulate our emotions through those early interactions. When that loop is broken, the world becomes confusing, unsafe. Many of us carry invisible echoes of this, of being ignored, of trying so hard to be loved, only to meet silence. So tonight, let the quiet feel different, not empty, not withholding, but full. Because you're here, and you're listening to yourself now. You were never wrong for needing someone to look at you and smile. You are not weak for wanting to be felt, to be met. And the next time you feel unseen, remember the baby inside you, still reaching, still hoping. The children who were watched like rats. What if your entire childhood was treated as a data point? In the 1920s, a psychologist named John B. Watson, often considered the father of behaviorism, believed that all human behavior could be controlled, predicted, and shaped through conditioning. To prove it, he turned his attention to the most moldable minds of all, infants. His most infamous experiment, little Albert. Albert was a 9-month-old baby, chosen for his calm temperament. At first, Watson exposed him to various objects: a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey, even a burning newspaper. The baby showed no fear. He reached out, curious and unafraid. Then Watson introduced a loud, startling noise, a sharp clang behind Albert's head, each time the rat appeared. Soon, Albert began to cry, not only at the sound, but at the rat itself. And then, disturbingly, at anything similar: a rabbit, a fur coat, even Santa's white beard. Watson had successfully installed fear. This was conditioning, he claimed. Proof that emotions like fear weren't inherited. They were taught, learned, engineered. But what happened to Albert after the experiment? No one knows for sure. He was never deconditioned, never treated. He simply disappeared from the study, a footnote in psychological history. Decades later, researchers claim to have identified him, a boy named Douglas Merritt, who died at age 6 from neurological complications. If true, he wasn't just an infant subject. He may have been a disabled child, chosen for convenience, not ethics. The little Albert experiment is a reminder that scientific curiosity, when left unchecked, can become cruelty wrapped in method, that beneath every chart is a person, a heartbeat, a childhood that didn't ask to be dissected. Watson's legacy shaped decades of psychological practice. But at what cost? We still condition children, don't we? Praise when they comply, withdrawal when they don't. We train them with screens, with silence, with threats wrapped in smiles. And then we wonder why they flinch at love, why they fear failure, why they carry invisible alarms that go off in calm rooms. So tonight, as your thoughts begin to settle, let little Albert's story float gently in the dark. You are not a subject. You are not a response waiting to be measured. And the fears you carry, those sudden, unexplained shivers, may not be yours alone. Some fears are inherited. Others were taught. The fake psychiatric ward that admitted everyone. What if sanity was just a performance and madness a matter of opinion? In 1973, psychiatrist David Rosenhan set out to test a troubling question. Can professionals truly tell the difference between someone who is mentally ill and someone who isn't? The result was one of the most unsettling psychological experiments in modern history. On being sane in insane places. Rosenhan recruited 8 perfectly healthy individuals, including himself. They had no history of mental illness. Their only instruction: visit a psychiatric hospital and claim to hear a single word. Thud. That was it. They described no other symptoms, no erratic behavior. Once admitted, they were to act normally, and yet, every single one of them was diagnosed with a serious mental disorder. Most were labeled with schizophrenia. Some remained hospitalized for weeks. None were detected as imposters by staff. Worse still, their normal behavior, journaling, speaking calmly, observing, was often interpreted as symptoms. Taking notes became obsessive behavior. Politeness was passive-aggressive. The experiment was meant to show a flaw in the system, and it did. But the story doesn't end there. After publication, one hospital challenged Rosenhan. We would never admit a healthy person. So he said, fine, I'll send some more. The hospital then claimed to detect 41 imposters out of 193 new patients. But Rosenhan had sent none. This wasn't just about hospitals. It was about labels, and how once given, they color everything, even reality. Once someone is called crazy, their truth becomes distorted, their identity rewritten, their actions reinterpreted through the lens of illness. And isn't this what we all fear? That if we break down even once, if we cry too loud, withdraw too long, confess something too strange, we'll be seen differently forever. The Rosenhan experiment didn't just challenge psychiatry. It revealed something deeper about how easily perception replaces truth. So tonight, if you've ever worried that your struggle would define you, let this settle in your heart. You are more than any label. You are not your diagnosis. You are not your worst day. And just because someone else puts you in a box doesn't mean you have to stay there. Sanity is not silence. It is not compliance. It is not a perfect performance. Sometimes sanity is simply the courage to say, I feel this. I see this. And I am still whole. The children who were cloned by praise. What happens when rewards don't just shape behavior, but erase identity? In the mid-20th century, psychologist B.F. Skinner, a towering figure in the world of behaviorism, believed that all human action could be trained, that free will was an illusion, that we are, at our core, creatures of cause and effect. To prove it, he didn't use torture. He used something far gentler, positive reinforcement. Skinner designed what's now called the Skinner box, a chamber in which animals, usually pigeons or rats, could be rewarded for specific behaviors. Press a lever, get a food pellet. Turn in a circle, get a treat. Soon, these animals learned complex routines, all trained by simple systems of reward. But Skinner didn't stop there. He applied these principles to children, even to his own daughter, Deborah, who was raised for a time in what he called an air crib, a temperature-controlled environment that limited unnecessary handling, intended to reduce stress. Though the crib wasn't as sinister as rumors made it seem, it did reflect Skinner's lifelong mission to engineer better humans through conditioning. He believed that by changing the environment, you could change the person. And in many ways, he was right. We are shaped by what we are praised for. We repeat what gets approval. We edit our personalities to be rewarded with grades, affection, social status. But here's the question: at what cost? What happens when children or adults begin to act only for reward? When every smile, every gesture, every achievement is calculated to receive approval. Slowly, something sacred is lost. The quiet voice that says, "I want this. I enjoy this. This is who I am." Instead, we ask, what will they think? Will they clap? Will I be enough if I don't perform? Skinner taught us how behavior can be molded, but he also left behind a haunting truth. People may follow the rules, but lose themselves doing so. Think about your own life. Have you ever succeeded and felt empty, achieved, but felt unknown? That's the shadow of conditioning. Success, built on approval, not authenticity. So tonight, as the world dims and your breathing softens, let yourself return to what was once quiet and untrained. The small joys that don't need applause, the movements no one taught you, the smile you wear when no one is watching, because your worth is not a lever, your life is not a test, and you were never meant to be programmed. You were meant to feel. The girl raised without touch. What if everything you needed to become human was never given? In the 1930s, a child named Anna was discovered in Pennsylvania. She had been hidden away in an attic, raised in almost complete isolation since infancy. No hugs, no conversation, no toys, no play, just a wooden chair, silence, and time. When she was found at age 6, Anna could not speak. She could not walk properly. She showed no signs of understanding human emotion. She was alive, but barely. A body with a beating heart, but no learned soul. No one had abused her with violence. They had abused her with absence. Anna became one of the earliest and most devastating cases studied under the lens of what psychologists call feral children, children raised without human contact, without language, without nurture. And what they discovered was simple and sad. Without social interaction, the human mind cannot grow. In Anna's case, even after years of care, she never fully recovered. She died before reaching adulthood. Her development frozen in a place no therapy could fully thaw. It wasn't her brain that was broken. It was the environment, the total absence of love, stimulation, and connection. Later cases, like Jeannie, another isolated child found in the 1970s, showed the same pattern. If language and love are not given in the earliest years, the window begins to close. And once it shuts, some things never fully open again. We often think of trauma as something loud, something explosive, but sometimes it's quiet deprivation that leaves the deepest scars. Think of all the small interactions that shape who we are. A smile from a parent, the sing-song of a lullaby, someone saying your name like it matters. When these are missing, the world becomes not just lonely, but unknowable. Anna's story is not just about one girl. It's about the invisible web we all need, the invisible hands that mold our language, our selfhood, our heart. So tonight, if you feel distant from the world, from people, from your own voice, let this be a soft reminder. Connection is not a luxury. It's the ground your mind stands on. And even now, it's not too late to reach out, to speak, to be heard, and to reclaim the pieces of you that silence tried to keep. because you were never meant to grow alone. The boy who was treated like a dog. What happens when a child is praised for obedience, but punished for thinking? In the 1920s, psychologists John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, yes, the same minds behind Little Albert, extended their behaviorist beliefs into parenting. Watson, in particular, believed that emotion had no place in child rearing. He warned parents against hugging, rocking, or even kissing their children too often. Why? Because love, he claimed, would make them weak, dependent, untrainable. So he proposed a radical alternative: raise children like animals in a lab. Controlled environment, clear rules, strict reward and punishment. Children, he said, should be conditioned like dogs, and just like dogs, they would become obedient, predictable, if you only reinforced the right behaviors and ignored the rest. Some parents listened. One boy, whose story later surfaced in scattered interviews, was raised under such strict Watsonian principles, he was never allowed to show anger. He was punished for crying. He had to ask permission to smile. Every display of emotion was treated as a behavioral flaw, a sign of weakness. On paper, he was a perfect child, quiet, polite, submissive, but inside, he was suffocating. As an adult, he spoke of feeling hollow, unsure how to express love, terrified of mistakes, haunted by a voice that said, "If you're not useful, you're nothing." This wasn't just one child. It was the blueprint for generations, raised on emotional suppression, taught to behave, not to feel, and that training is hard to unlearn. How? Many of us were praised for being low maintenance, for not crying, not speaking up, not needing too much. And how many of us mistook that for strength, when it was really a fear of disappointing the ones who withheld affection? The boy, raised like a dog, didn't fail. He adapted. But adaptation is not the same as growth. So tonight, if you find yourself apologizing for your emotions, or struggling to express what hurts, remember this: you were not born to be trained. You were born to feel. Tears are not weakness. Smiles are not performance. And you don't have to earn love by being silent. You are not an experiment. You are a person. And your heart was never meant to be leashed. The faces that disappeared in the crowd. What if your brain quietly erased someone just because they were different? In the 1980s, a series of studies in social psychology began to explore something chilling: the ease with which the human mind depersonalizes those who fall outside its circle. These weren't headline-grabbing experiments. No wires, no cages, no screaming children, just pictures and silence. Researchers showed participants photographs of people from different backgrounds, different races, different social classes, different appearances. Then, using rapid response tools like implicit association tests, they tracked how quickly or slowly the brain responded to these faces. The result: some faces lit up recognition pathways immediately. Others barely registered, not because the participants were outwardly hostile, but because their brains had quietly categorized those people as less relevant. This phenomenon is called dehumanized perception, not active hatred, but something colder: indifference. Studies showed that when people viewed images of the homeless, drug addicts, prisoners, or racial minorities, the parts of the brain associated with empathy and understanding were less active. It's not that they didn't care, it's that their brains never fully saw them. This isn't something reserved for villains. It's something we all do, unconsciously. A stranger on the street, a janitor in the hallway, a migrant on the news. We glance and move on, because acknowledging Their full humanity would mean acknowledging their pain. And sometimes, that feels too heavy. But ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. It just teaches the brain that some lives are background noise, that some suffering isn't urgent. The truth is, our perception is not neutral. It's shaped by history, media, repetition, and every time we choose not to see someone, we rehearse a version of the world where some people matter more than others. So, tonight, as you lie still and the day fades away, ask yourself softly, who have I failed to see? Whose face have I glanced past, simply because I didn't have to look? And just as gently, remind yourself, every life is full, every face is sacred, and the act of seeing, truly seeing, is where empathy begins. Don't let the crowd erase people. Let your heart pull them back into focus. The shock collars of silence. How do you train someone to be silent without ever touching them? In the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted an experiment that would reshape how we understand hopelessness. It began, as many of these stories do, with animals. He placed dogs in a box where they would receive random, inescapable electric shocks, no matter what the dogs did. Bark, jump, whimper. The shocks kept coming. There was no way out, no escape, no pattern. Eventually, the dogs stopped trying. They lay down, silent. They had learned something that would later be called learned helplessness. The belief that nothing you do will ever change your situation. In later trials, even when the door was opened, even when freedom was right there, the dogs wouldn't leave. They had already accepted defeat. They had stopped believing in effort, and that belief stayed, even when the pain no longer did. It was a brutal metaphor, and one that didn't stay in the lab. Seligman later connected this phenomenon to humans, to depression, to trauma, to poverty, to anyone who's ever been punished, for speaking up, for resisting, for trying, and then stop trying altogether. You may know someone like this. Maybe you've been someone like this. Not lazy, not weak, just tired of pushing on a locked door. And when that door finally opens, the fear says, what if it shuts again? What if it was never meant for me? Learned helplessness is not a flaw in character. It's a wound in the belief system, a quiet voice that says, you're not allowed to leave, but here's the truth. That voice is lying, because the shocks have stopped. The door is open. And even if your legs feel heavy, even if your trust feels broken, you can still stand. So, tonight, in the quiet space between breaths, remind yourself, you are not trapped. You are not powerless. You are not a prisoner of old pain. And the next time your mind says, why try? Whisper back, because I'm still here, and I haven't given up. The invisible rope around the brain can fear condition you so deeply that you never test your freedom again. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Joseph Wolper studied anxiety not just through words, but through response patterns, the body's habits of fear. He wanted to understand how people could become trapped in phobias, not because the danger remained, but because their mind believed it always would. The idea was rooted in earlier conditioning experiments, where cats were shocked, in cages, and later refused to leave even when the doors were wide open. They had learned their limits, and they never questioned them again. Wolpe realized something profound. The mind does not always update its truth. Once fear sets in, it becomes a map, even if the terrain has changed. So he developed a method called systematic desensitization, a way to gently retrain the brain by exposing it to fear in tiny doses, paired with safety. Slowly, a person with a deep phobia of elevators, of flying, of open spaces, could begin to rewire the associations, not by being told to get over it, but by being shown, softly, repeatedly, that the threat is gone, because trauma doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, "Don't go there. It'll hurt again," even when the door is open, even when the light is pouring in. And so we shrink, we avoid, we shape our lives around old wounds, crafting entire routines to never feel that panic again. But fear is not always a sign of danger. Sometimes it's just a memory your body hasn't learned to forget. Think about your life. What rooms have you avoided because of one bad day? What dreams did you shelf after one rejection? What paths have you tiptoed around because your mind still flinches at the echo of pain? You are not broken. You are simply following a map that once kept you safe, but may no longer serve you. So, tonight, let this be your quiet rebellion. Step to the edge of the map. Look beyond it. Feel your breath, steady and whole. And remember, the rope that holds you back might not even be real. It might just be a story, and you are allowed to rewrite it. The stranger you became to yourself. What happens when you look in the mirror and no longer recognize who's staring back? In the 1970s, psychologist Bruce McEwen studied how chronic stress reshapes not just mood, but memory, identity, even the architecture of the brain. He found that prolonged exposure to emotional strain, especially from trauma, abuse, or instability, can actually rewire the hippocampus, the region responsible for memory and self-recognition. In essence, too much pain for too long, and your brain starts to forget who you were. This is not poetic. It's biological. People under chronic stress begin to dissociate. They forget birthdays. They can't describe their feelings. They look at old photos and say, "That doesn't feel like me anymore." And in some cases, that disconnection becomes so intense, they experience depersonalization, the eerie sense of watching themselves from outside, as if they are a stranger wearing their own skin. You don't have to experience war or violence to feel this. Sometimes it's growing up in a home where emotions weren't safe, where your joy was too loud, where your sadness was inconvenient. So you learned to fold, not loudly, quietly. You adjusted your tone, smiled on command, became what was needed until you forgot what wasn't. This is how many of us become strangers to ourselves. Not in one moment, but in thousands of little edits. The you that stayed quiet, the you that laughed at what hurt, the you that performed, just to be allowed to stay. McEwen's work revealed that trauma isn't always about what happens to us. Sometimes it's about what was forced to stop expressing. But here's the beautiful, quiet truth. The brain is plastic. It changes, and it can heal. Every act of self-honesty is a stitch in the old fabric. Every time you say, "This is what I feel," you light a match in the dark. So tonight, if the mirror feels foggy, if your reflection seems unfamiliar, don't panic. You are still there. You've just been quiet too long. Let this be the whisper that brings you back. You are not a performance. You are not a stranger. You are a home returning to itself, one truth at a time. The experiment that split the room in half. What if being labeled gifted or slow changed your future before you even knew who you were? In 1968, psychologist Robert Rosenthal conducted a study in an elementary school that seemed innocent on the surface. He and his colleague, Lenore Jacobson, gave students an IQ test, then told the teachers that certain children, selected at random, were about to experience a spurt in intellectual growth. These kids were not special. Their scores were average, But the teachers didn't know that, and over the next several months, something strange happened. The children labeled as bloomers actually improved, not just in test scores, but in confidence, behavior, and classroom performance. Why? Because the teachers expected more from them, spoke to them with more warmth, gave them more time to answer, smiled more. This became known as the Pygmalion effect, the idea that expectations shape reality, not just in labs, but in classrooms, offices, families. When someone believes in us, we begin to rise. But here's the shadow. The opposite is also true. This experiment also revealed something darker. The golem effect. When a teacher believed a child wasn't capable, the child began to shrink, speak less, try less, believe less. And it wasn't because of talent. It was because of a story. One the child never wrote, but was forced to live in. How many times has someone else's low expectation been your ceiling? She's shy. He's not leadership material. They'll never understand this. Labels stick, especially when they're spoken softly, or implied through tone, or written between lines on a report card. And over time, we begin to act in a way that matches the label, not our potential. This is the quiet tragedy of the Rosenthal study, that a single belief, even unspoken, can shape a life. But here's the quiet power. You can rewrite the script. You can become your own observer. You can speak to yourself the way the best teacher would. I see something in you. Try again. I believe you can. You are not finished. So tonight, let go of the labels that were never yours. You are not average. You are not behind. You are not a number on a chart. You are possibility. And it's still blooming. The mask you didn't know you were wearing. What if people treat you differently just because of what you're told to wear? In 1979, social psychologist Edward Diener conducted an experiment on Halloween night. It involved candy, costumes, and the power of anonymity. Children came to the door in groups. Some were asked their names and where they lived. Others remained anonymous. Then, the candy bowl was placed in front of them with a sign. Please take only one. The adults stepped away. What happened next was telling. The anonymous children, those whose identities were hidden behind costumes and masks, were more likely to steal extra candy, especially when in groups. The moment they felt unseen, they acted differently. This effect is known as deindividuation, the psychological state where people lose their sense of personal responsibility when they become part of a crowd or when their identity is obscured. It's the same force that fuels online trolling, mob violence, and group cruelty. When we feel faceless, we act without conscience, but it works in the other direction too. Experiments have shown that when people wear uniforms, especially those associated with power or aggression, they start to embody those traits. In one famous study, participants given guards' uniforms became more controlling and harsh. Even when told it was just a game, their clothes changed their behavior, not because they were bad, but because the mask gave them permission. Now, think of the masks you've worn, not literal ones, the emotional ones. The confident smile that hides exhaustion, the quiet compliance that masks your disagreement, the performance of okay when you are anything but. We wear them to fit in, to stay safe, to meet expectations. But over time, we forget where the mask ends, and we begin. And that's the quiet danger. When we're too long in costume, we begin to think it's our skin. So tonight, as the world grows quiet and the mask can safely come off, ask yourself, what have I done just because I thought no one was looking? And what part of me have I hidden so well? Even I forgot it was there. You are more than what you pretend to be, more than the roles you've worn. And beneath the mask, You are still whole, still worthy, still real. The baby who was left to cry. What happens when comfort is withheld? Not out of cruelty, but by design. In the early 20th century, pediatrician John B. Watson, the same behaviorist behind Little Albert, published a parenting book that would ripple through generations. In it, he warned against spoiling children with affection. No cuddling, no rocking to sleep, no unnecessary holding. Never hug or kiss them, he wrote. Shake hands with them in the morning. Why? Because Watson believed that love, like all human behavior, could be conditioned into weakness, that babies should be taught to be independent from birth, that crying was not a call for connection, but a bad habit that should be extinguished. This idea, while extreme, seeped into parenting culture. For decades, crying it out became the norm. A baby wailing in the dark wasn't seen as heartbreaking, but as necessary training for a resilient child. And the result? Thousands of infants learned early that no one comes when I cry. That distress leads to silence, not comfort. That the world is not to be trusted, only survived. Modern neuroscience tells us something different. That when babies cry, they aren't manipulating, they're communicating, they're asking, in the only language they know, is anyone there? And if no one comes, again and again, the baby stops asking, stops trusting, and builds a nervous system tuned not for love, but for loneliness. This is called attachment wounding. It doesn't always come from neglect or abuse. Sometimes it comes from philosophies, from good intentions, from advice passed down in books and whispered in nurseries. But the child doesn't know that. They only know how it felt, and many of us still carry that feeling, that inner flinch, that belief that our needs are too much, that to be loved, we must be quiet, self-sufficient, unaffected. So tonight, if a part of you feels ashamed to need comfort, to cry, to ask, to be held, let this truth wash over you. Your need is not a flaw. Your longing is not a weakness. And the baby you once were deserved to be held. Even now, it's not too late to soothe, to listen, to say with gentleness, I hear you, I'm here, and I'm not leaving. The mirror that lied back. What if the way you see yourself was never really your reflection? In the 1980s, psychologist Thomas F. Cash began studying something many of us carry silently, body image distortion. He asked people to look in a mirror and describe what they saw. Then he asked them to walk past it and recall their own shape from memory. Again and again, participants overestimated their flaws. They saw themselves as wider, smaller, weaker, uglier than they really were. Some even avoided looking at the mirror altogether. This wasn't about vanity, it was about perception. Cash's research revealed that body image isn't about what you actually look like. It's about what your mind has learned to expect. And those expectations are shaped by repetition, by comments, by comparison, by moments too small to name, but sharp enough to stay. A single childhood jab. You've put on weight, a cruel laugh in the locker room, the unspoken pause when someone else gets the compliment you hoped for. These moments become lenses, and over time, they warp the mirror. Eventually, you're not seeing your body. You're seeing the criticism you absorbed. This phenomenon affects men, women, children, athletes, models, mothers, survivors. It's not rooted in fact. It's rooted in feeling. And the more we chase a perfect reflection, the more we drift from the truth that we were never meant to look like someone else. We were meant to inhabit this body, not apologize for it. Cash's work opened doors to treatments for body dysmorphia, eating disorders, and identity-related depression. But its most powerful lesson was this: you cannot heal a reflection by changing the mirror. You must change the story. So tonight, before you close your eyes, imagine standing in front of a mirror that tells the truth, that you are more than your shape, more than your scars, more than the stretch, the softness, the structure. You are not a mistake to be fixed. You are a body that has carried you through everything, and it deserves love. Not someday, not when it's smaller, but now. Exactly, as it is. The faces you thought were angry. What if your fear of judgment made you misread kindness? In the early 2000s, a series of psychological experiments explored how trauma and social anxiety distort one of our most basic abilities, facial recognition, and not the technical kind, but emotional interpretation. Researchers presented participants with ambiguous facial expressions, subtle frowns, half smiles, neutral stares. What they discovered was quietly devastating. People with a history of rejection, bullying, or neglect were more likely to interpret these expressions as negative, even when they weren't. A neutral face was read as disapproval, a thoughtful expression as anger, a simple silence as a threat. It's called hostile attribution bias, a tendency to assume others are judging or rejecting you, even when there's no evidence, and it doesn't come from nowhere. It's built over time, through micro-experiences. The parent who never softened their gaze, the friend who rolled their eyes one too many times, the teacher who called on you only to correct, the hallway glances that felt like whispers. Eventually your brain learns a rule. They don't like me. And every face becomes a test. Even in adulthood, this bias lingers. At work, you over-explain. In conversations, you apologize for existing. In public, you assume people are laughing at you, not near you. It's not because you're paranoid. It's because you were taught, by pain, to read the room through fear. But here's what the studies didn't always say out loud. This isn't permanent. The brain is plastic, and perception can be unlearned. Gently, slowly, patiently, one smile at a time. One pause before assuming the worst. One friend who says, "I'm not mad. I was just thinking." So tonight, let the tension in your chest loosen. You are not a burden, not an interruption, not someone everyone is secretly judging. Most people aren't thinking about you at all. And that's not rejection. That's freedom. And the next time a face looks unclear, try this. Don't fill it with fear. Fill it with possibility. Maybe they're shy. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're just neutral. And maybe, just maybe, you're more welcome than you think. The puppet who didn't know he was being watched. What if your choices were never fully your own? In the early 2000s, a groundbreaking series of experiments led by neuroscientist Benjamin Libet reignited one of humanity's oldest debates. Do we really have free will? Participants were asked to perform a simple task: press a button whenever they felt like it. No timer, no prompt, just act on impulse. As they did, Libet recorded their brain activity using EEG scans, and what he found was unsettling. The brain showed signs of preparing to move, up to half a second before the participant was consciously aware of deciding. The body knew before the mind did. The choice was already in motion, and the feeling of "I've decided" came after. This sparked waves of philosophical panic. If the brain acts before we decide, then what is choice? Are we puppets pulled by invisible strings? Neurons firing in the dark? Libet himself didn't believe free will was an illusion. He proposed something gentler, that we may not choose to act, but we can choose to veto the action. A pause, a resistance, the quiet power to say, "Not now." Even if the thought arises from nowhere, we still hold the ability to shape it. But what this experiment truly revealed is something deeper. How much of our behavior is automatic? Think about it. How often do you react without thinking? Say, yes, when you mean no. Pick up your phone, scroll, speak, nod. Not because you chose to, but because you didn't interrupt the script. We live on autopilot more than we realize. Trained by habit, by fear, by expectation, and while that doesn't make us powerless, it does make us predictable, unless we notice, unless we pause, unless we gently take back the reins. So tonight, let your awareness become your freedom. You are not the puppet. You are the breath between the thought and the action. You are the moment of choice, and in that moment, you are free. The room where no one screamed. What if silence wasn't calm, but a symptom? In the 1960s, psychiatrist John Zubek conducted a series of controversial experiments on sensory deprivation, the complete removal of external stimuli from the human experience. No sound, no light, no touch, just a person, alone in a room, floating in stillness. Volunteers were placed in padded environments, wearing goggles and gloves, cut off from all forms of stimulation. The goal? To study what happens to the mind when the world is taken away. The results came quickly, and they were deeply unsettling. After just a few hours, participants reported difficulty thinking. After a day, some became anxious, paranoid. After 2 days, hallucinations began. Voices, lights, crawling sensations. One participant described seeing an entire parade march through the room. In total silence. Many begged to leave before their time was up, not because of pain, but because of nothingness. Zubek's work was halted. The ethical concerns were too great, but the message lingered. The brain doesn't thrive in silence. It needs noise. It needs input. It builds its reality from feedbacks, from the friction of experience. Without it, reality crumbles inward. And yet today, many of us live in a form of low-level sensory deprivation, not in padded rooms, but in emotional ones. We scroll, numb. We sit in quiet apartments with no touch, no laughter, no meaningful sound. We perform stillness, not as peace, but as survival. And we wonder why the world feels distant, why thoughts loop, why we start to disappear inside ourselves. It's not always trauma. Sometimes it's just too little of everything. Too few hugs, too few conversations, too little color, texture, connection. And so the mind invents things to feel alive again. So tonight, if the silence around you feels heavy instead of healing, don't ignore it. Listen. Not all stillness is sacred. Some is a signal, a soft cry for input, for life, for touch. And the answer doesn't need to be loud. It can be as small as a call, a song, a word, a lamp turned on just to soften the dark. You don't have to scream, but you do deserve to be heard. The stranger inside the mirror's maze. What if changing your choices changed your memory? In the 1980s, psychologists Elizabeth Loftus and Jacqueline Pickrell set out to explore something unnerving, just how easy it is to plant false memories. They called it the Lost in the Mall experiment. Participants were asked to recall childhood memories. Among the real ones, they were told a fictional event. You were lost in a shopping mall at age 5. Parents confirmed this never happened. But after a few sessions, something strange occurred. Many participants began to remember the fake event. They described the lights, the panic, the store signs, the stranger who helped them, tears that never fell, memories that were never real. What Loftus uncovered was profound. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. Every time we recall something, we reshape it slightly, adding color, cutting edges, smoothing facts to fit feelings. And when someone in authority, a therapist, a family member, a friend, suggests a memory, the brain, eager to explain itself, can make one up. This discovery had ripple effects through courtrooms, therapy rooms, and family dynamics. It raised urgent questions. If a memory can be false, how do we trust our own past? But the truth is more gentle than terrifying. False memories don't mean our minds are broken. They mean our minds are creative. They fill gaps. They seek meaning. They build bridges between fragments. And sometimes they protect us. We all carry mirror mazes in our memory. Paths we've taken so many times they feel true, even if they lead nowhere. Pain we've dulled. Events we've rearranged. People we've remembered, not as they were, but as we needed them to be. And that's not failure. That's humanity. So, tonight, if you feel unsure of what really happened, if your memories blur or shift, if some scenes feel too polished, too faded, or too distant to explain, be kind to your remembering self. You are not a liar, you are a storyteller, and some stories are meant to heal, not just record. You are not trapped in your past, you are always rebuilding it with every breath. The invisible weight of the unchosen option. What if every decision you've made is haunted by the ones you didn't? In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced a concept that quietly explains much of our daily discomfort: cognitive dissonance. The tension that arises when our actions and beliefs don't align. It's not a loud tension. It's not panic. It's a quiet itch. A whisper that says, "Why did I do that? Was that really me?" Festinger's most famous study involved students who were asked to perform a dull, repetitive task. Afterward, some were paid $1 to tell the next participant it was fun. Others were paid $20 to do the same. The surprising result, those paid only $1 were more likely to actually believe the task was fun. Why? Because lying for $1 wasn't worth it. So their brain adjusted their memory to reduce the discomfort. Maybe it wasn't so bad. This is the engine of dissonance. We don't just justify our actions. We reshape our beliefs to match them. Think of the times you stayed in a job you hated and started telling yourself, maybe this is what I want, or defended a relationship you'd outgrown, because walking away would make the years invested feel like a mistake. We minimize regret by editing the story, not to deceive others, but to soothe ourselves. But dissonance doesn't go away when ignored. It stays under the surface. Pressure in the chest, a hesitation in the voice, a pause before answering honestly when someone asks, "Are you happy?" It's not failure. It's a symptom of growing, because every decision we make means leaving something behind. And we grieve even the choices we never chose. So tonight, if you feel unsettled, uncertain, if you catch yourself saying, "Why does this still bother me?" You're not broken, you're just human, trying to reconcile 100 versions of yourself into one life. And maybe, instead of forcing perfect harmony, you can let some dissonance be. Not every contradiction needs to be resolved. Sometimes peace isn't about choosing one truth. It's about letting them coexist quietly within you. The numbers that changed, who you are. What if being measured made you smaller? In the 1960s, psychologist Claude Steele began uncovering a phenomenon that still shapes how we think, work, and define ourselves today. He called it stereotype threat. The idea that when people are reminded of a negative stereotype about their identity, they often perform worse. Not because they believe it, but because they fear proving it true. In one famous study, black students and white students were given the same test. When told it was just a problem-solving task, scores were similar, but when told it was an intelligence test, the black students performed worse, not because they were less intelligent, but because the weight of the stereotype made them anxious, self-conscious, afraid. The pressure to represent their group quietly sabotaged their ability to just be. This effect didn't just show up by race. It showed up with gender. When women were told they were taking a math test, with age, when older adults were reminded they might have poor memory, with class, accent, disability, appearance. The reminder didn't need to be aggressive, just a nudge, a checkbox, a glance, and suddenly, the person in front of the test was no longer just themselves, but a symbol fighting invisible gravity. How often have you felt this? Walking into a room, already aware of how different you are, answering a question, already worried how you'll be judged, making a mistake, and hearing not just your inner critic, but the echo of everyone who ever doubted you. Stereotype threat is quiet, but it's powerful, and worst of all, it makes people blame themselves for the very pressure they're under. But Steele's work also gave us a path forward. When people are told they belong, when the environment affirms their value, when identity is acknowledged but not reduced, the gap begins to close, performance rises, stress fades, the person re-emerges. So tonight, let go of the roles you were forced to carry. You are not a representative. You are not a rebuttal to someone else's bias. You are not here to prove a point. You are already enough, even when the world forgets to say so, and you don't have to shrink to fit inside someone else's measure. The voice that vanished when it was needed. What if your silence wasn't a choice, but a conditioned response? In the 1980s, psychologist Martin Seligman, the same mind behind learned helplessness, studied how trauma can suppress agency, the ability to act, speak, or resist, even when the threat is gone. He noticed something subtle in both animals and humans. If someone is punished or ignored enough times for speaking up, they eventually stop trying altogether. Even when the room is safe, even when someone finally asks, "What do you think?" they freeze. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they've been trained to believe no one will listen. This is more common than we admit. Children, raised in homes where opinions weren't welcome. Students punished for questioning the teacher. Partners shut down by defensiveness or ridicule. Employees told, "You're overreacting," when they speak truth. These aren't arguments. They are emotional shutdowns. Repeated reminders. That voice equals danger. Over time, this doesn't just make people quiet. It rewires the nervous system. The moment they feel disagreement, their heart races. Their breath shortens. Their body braces. Even when the space is safe. It's called fawning. A trauma response where someone appeases, agrees, minimizes their needs to avoid conflict. Not because they're weak, but because they've learned silence is survival. But what this response hides is something sacred, a voice that still exists, even if it hasn't been used in a while. Because healing doesn't mean becoming louder. It means remembering that your thoughts matter, and you don't need permission to share them. So tonight, if you've been carrying unsaid things, if you shrink when someone raises their voice, if you nod along even when you disagree inside, know this: your silence was once a shield, but you're allowed to put it down now. The world may not always be safe, but you are strong enough now to risk the sound, and when you speak again, even quietly, it will not be weakness. It will be returning to yourself, the lie that became the truth. After repeating it enough, what if the stories you believe about yourself were never truly yours? In the 1940s, psychologists Fritz Heider and later Harold Kelly introduced what's now called attribution theory. The way we explain the causes of things, especially about ourselves and others. When we fail, we ask, why did this happen? And often, the answer isn't neutral. It's filtered through memory, through identity, through bias. Over time, if you're told you're lazy, or dramatic, or difficult, you might start to believe those things, not because they were true, but because repetition feels like evidence. This is the danger of internalized false attribution. We mistake repetition for truth. We confuse familiarity with accuracy, and the lie, once planted, becomes part of our internal dialogue. Think of the child who spills a glass of milk and hears, "You're so clumsy." The teen who cries and is told, "You're too sensitive." The adult who hesitates and is labeled, "You're just not a leader." None of these are objective truths, but if heard enough, especially from people we trust, they begin to live inside us like facts. And then, even without the voices around us, we repeat them ourselves. Why bother? I'll mess it up anyway. I'm not the kind of person who succeeds. This is how beliefs are built, not always by insight, but by echo. But here's what attribution theory also reminds us. We can rewrite the why. We can say, that didn't happen because I'm broken. It happened because I was afraid. I didn't fail because I'm weak. I failed because I wasn't supported. This isn't who I am. It's who I was trained to believe I am. And slowly, truth returns. Not the loud, perfect kind, the quiet, earned kind. So tonight, listen for the words you say to yourself when no one's around. Whose voice is that? And if it doesn't sound like kindness, or curiosity, or truth, then maybe it's time to stop repeating it and replace it with something softer, more honest, more you. The game that turned trust into a weapon. What if betrayal was part of the design? In the 1950s, psychologists devised a social experiment called the prisoner's dilemma, a theoretical game that asked a simple question with impossible consequences. If two people are accused of a crime and held in separate rooms, each has a choice: stay silent or betray the other. If both stay silent, they receive minimal punishment. If one betrays while the other stays loyal, the betrayer walks free while the loyal one suffers. If both betray, they both lose. It was just a thought experiment, but it captured something painfully real. Trust is fragile, and when fear enters the room, even friends can turn. Later versions of the prisoner's dilemma were tested with real people in labs, classrooms, negotiations, and time after time, the same pattern emerged. At first, people trusted. They collaborated. They gave each other the benefit of the doubt. But when one betrayal occurred, just one, the spiral began. Retaliation, cynicism, withdrawal. This became a model for how human relationships unravel, how nations go to war, how marriages collapse, how friendships break, not from one moment, but from the erosion of trust, drop by drop. And here's the quiet tragedy. Even when people wanted to cooperate again, they didn't know how. Fear had rewired the rules. Does that feel familiar? Have you ever been hurt once, and then built walls so high, even love couldn't climb them? Have you ever withheld your truth because once, long ago, someone used it against you? That's not weakness. That's adaptation. But like the players in the game, we often forget that the rules can change, that not everyone is the person who hurt us, that not every risk ends in betrayal. That trust, once lost, can be rebuilt slowly, delicately, intentionally. So tonight, if your heart feels armored, if you brace for impact, even in soft spaces, if you've convinced yourself that protection is better than connection, remember, the goal was never to win the game. It was to start playing it. You don't have to outsmart everyone. You just have to let someone in. One choice at a time. One moment of quiet trust. That's how the pattern breaks and how safety returns. The button that made you think you had control. What if the power you feel is just an illusion designed to keep you calm? It's a strange idea, unsettling even. But in the 1970s, psychologists began to study something they called the illusion of control. And what they found was quietly profound. They discovered that people feel better, calmer, safer, more secure when they believe they have influence, even when they don't. That belief, they realized, doesn't need to be grounded in reality to have a real effect. It just needs to feel true. Take the elevator button, for example, the one labeled closed door. In countless buildings across the world, that button is not connected to anything. It does not actually speed up the process. The elevator door closes when the internal timer tells it to, not when your finger presses the plastic square. And yet, people press it every day, repeatedly. And what happens next is not the door closing, but a wave of relief, as if doing something makes the waiting more bearable, as if we've taken back a little bit of time, a little bit of control. The same is true at pedestrian crosswalks. That comforting button to summon the walk signal, often disconnected. It changes nothing, but pressing it makes people feel seen, involved, in command. Psychologists began asking deeper questions. If these tiny meaningless choices make us feel more secure, how much of our broader sense of agency is also manufactured? How much of what we call freedom is just a carefully constructed set of options? Options that keep us docile, compliant, hopeful. In one study, participants were subjected to bursts of unpleasant noise. Half were told they could stop the noise at any time by pressing a button. The other half were given no such control. But here's the twist. The button didn't actually do anything. The noise came regardless. And yet, the group with the fake button reported significantly less stress. They believed they had a say, and that belief, though false, calmed their nervous systems. In another study, people were asked to play a gambling game. One group was allowed to pick their own dice before rolling. The other group was handed random dice. The outcome was entirely based on chance. No skill, no control, no hidden patterns. But participants who got to choose their dice bet higher, felt more confident, and reported greater satisfaction. Why? Because the illusion of control gave them comfort. It gave them purpose. It gave them meaning. And isn't that the crux of it? We're not always looking for real power. We're looking for the feeling of power. We want to feel that our hands on the wheel matter, that our choices are ours, that life isn't just happening to us, but through us, that we have agency, direction, influence. But when you look closely, much of life is designed to offer choice without freedom, influence without impact, autonomy with boundaries already drawn. Think about it. We're told we can choose our careers, but only from the list society deems valuable. We're told to vote, but in systems where the candidates are pre-selected and the rules of engagement were written long before we arrived. We're told to express ourselves, but only within the algorithms that decide what rises, what vanishes, what echoes back. We're given the illusion of voice, of reach, of discovery, all while invisible hands curate what we see, what we want, what we believe is possible. And yet, we play along, not because we're weak, but because we're human, because believing we have a say even a small one, makes the chaos feel manageable. The mind prefers illusion to helplessness. It prefers false structure to open-ended uncertainty. We'd rather press a button that does nothing than sit idle in ambiguity. We'd rather believe we might change the outcome than accept that it's already been decided. Because hope, even misplaced, is a balm. But what happens when we start to notice? What happens when we ask, is this real power or just a placebo? Am I participating or am I being performed through? That question doesn't always feel empowering. Sometimes it feels like a void, a pulling away of the curtain, only to find a script we didn't write. But within that discomfort lies something quietly radical: awareness. Because once you recognize the frame, you're no longer a passive character inside it. You don't have to smash it. You don't have to rage against it. You just begin to see. And that seeing, that subtle, steady gaze into the constructed architecture of your life, is a kind of power all its own. Awareness doesn't always change your circumstances, but it changes your relationship to them. You begin to see where your choices are real and where they're curated. You begin to notice which levers move things and which only feel like movement. You notice how systems reward passivity dressed as participation, how options are presented as freedom, when in truth, they're often just variations of the same containment. And yet, it's not hopeless. Because noticing isn't nihilism. Noticing is waking up. When you see the illusion, you don't have to reject comfort, but you get to choose how much comfort you want from truth, not from trickery. You get to decide which illusions serve you and which keep you small. You get to ask again and again, does this make me free or just calm? This doesn't mean abandoning everything. It doesn't mean retreating to cynicism. Sometimes the placebo has purpose. Belief can soothe. Ritual can ground. Even when the control isn't real, the calm it brings can help you move through your day, your grief, your uncertainty. But there's a difference between using illusion as a tool and being used by it. One is choice. The other is conditioning. So tonight, as your body softens and your mind begins to float, ask yourself, where in your life are you pressing buttons that do nothing? What roles do you play to feel in control, even when you're not? What stories do you tell yourself to avoid the quiet truth that much of what surrounds you was designed for someone else's comfort, not your liberation? And more importantly, what can you still choose? Not just within the frame, but beyond it, because even in a world of scripted paths, you can choose how you walk. You can choose what stories you believe. You can choose presence over performance. You can choose curiosity over compliance. You can choose to ask hard questions, not to shatter your world, but to enter it more honestly. You can choose to be awake, and that too is a kind of power, not flashy, not always seen, but deeply real. It's the power of awareness, the power of pause, the power to know when control is real and when it's ritual, the power to create meaning, not just consume it, to choose what you do outside the frame, once you've seen it for what it is. So much of life is a stage, but not every actor forgets they're in a play. Some step backstage, some write new, the scripts, some whisper lines that weren't in the original draft, and in doing so, they become something rare. Not just performers, but creators. Tonight, as you drift into that quiet space, between waking and dreaming, hold this truth gently. Control is a story, and stories can comfort, but awareness. Awareness is the moment you open your eyes and realize you can also write your own. You don't need to destroy the systems to reclaim yourself. You just need to see. Because seeing, truly seeing, is where real agency begins. And from that seeing comes choice. Not always loud, not always praised, but deeply, quietly yours. The stranger behind the smile. What if pretending to be okay made you forget what pain feels like? In the 1970s, psychologist Paul Ekman, one of the most important pioneers in understanding facial expressions, began uncovering a quiet contradiction inside the human body. He discovered that while we can manipulate our faces into expressions, force a smile, suppress a frown, the body remains honest. The muscles around the mouth can move on command, but the eyes, they don't lie so easily. A real smile, the kind known as the Duchenne smile, involves involuntary muscles near the corners of the eyes, tiny subtle contractions we can't consciously control. That's what makes them different. That's what makes them true. You can raise your lips for a camera, widen your eyes for a joke, even tilt your head with feigned warmth. But unless your body agrees, the expression is incomplete. And more than that, Ekman's research revealed something deeper. If you fake a smile for long enough, you don't just trick the people around you. You start to trick yourself. It begins innocently. You're at work, and someone asks how you're doing. You say, "I'm good," because it's easier than explaining that you feel numb. A friend calls you out for coffee, and you agree, even though your chest feels like it's sinking. You laugh at a joke you don't find funny. You nod in meetings you don't follow. You brush away concern with, "Don't worry about me." Each time you do it, your face plays a part and your voice plays along. The world applauds your resilience, your politeness, your positivity. You get so good at wearing the mask that after a while, it doesn't feel like a mask anymore. It just feels like you. Until one night, when you're alone, and you realize you haven't felt joy. Not real joy. In weeks, or maybe months. You haven't cried, because there's no time. You haven't screamed, because it would scare someone. You haven't told the truth, because you're not sure how anymore. Ekman's research wasn't just about smiles. It was about the subtle betrayals of the body. He later helped develop systems to detect micro-expressions, fleeting movements in the face that reveal true emotion before a person can suppress it. These flashes of truth last less than a second, but they're real. A twitch of anger, a flicker of fear, a flash of sadness behind the eyes. The world became fascinated by his findings, especially in fields like law enforcement and lie detection. But maybe his most important contribution wasn't about detecting lies in others. Maybe it was about noticing the ones we tell ourselves. When you perform happiness long enough, it stops being performance. It becomes habit, and then it becomes identity. You forget what unfiltered pain feels like. You forget how to cry without apology. You forget what it's like to say, "Actually, I'm not okay." We live in a culture that rewards the mask. Smile for the photo. Stay strong for the kids. Don't burden anyone. Don't make it awkward. Don't be dramatic. Over time, these rules become reflexes. We start managing our emotions instead of feeling them. We translate grief into tiredness. We rebrand anxiety as busyness. We confuse numbness with peace. And our bodies, those quiet archives of everything we haven't expressed, begin to ache. The shoulders stay tense. The jaw clenches at night. The breath becomes shallow. Sleep becomes fragmented. And laughter, the real kind, the kind that bursts from the chest without planning, it grows rare. Because when you're always performing, you forget how to rest. Not just physically, but emotionally. The truth is, there's nothing wrong with smiling. Nothing wrong with showing up, putting on your best face, doing what needs to be done. Strength is not the enemy, but when smiling becomes your only setting, when your emotions become a performance you manage for the comfort of others, that's when You begin to lose access to yourself. Pain doesn't go away because you hide it. It waits. It tucks itself into your posture, your voice, your digestion, your restlessness. It lingers behind polite phrases. It waits for silence. It waits for stillness. And when there's finally no one around to impress, that pain whispers, "I'm still here. Please don't forget me." There's something quietly radical about asking yourself, in the privacy of your own heart, what am I actually feeling? Not what do I want to feel? Not what do I think I should feel? But what is really there? Beneath the practiced smile, what truth have I outperformed so well? I almost believe the performance myself. What grief is waiting to be named? What fear is waiting to be held? What part of me is waiting to be allowed to not be okay? These aren't dramatic questions. They're honest ones. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is whisper the answer. Maybe tonight is a chance to try, to sit still, to turn off the performing voice, to let the corners of your mouth relax, to feel the tightness in your chest without distracting yourself from it, to notice the flicker of sadness behind your own eyes. You don't have to fix it. You don't even have to explain it. Just notice. Just allow. Just be. The body is not your enemy. It's your witness. It remembers every time you wanted to cry, but didn't. Every time you held in the sigh. Every time you felt the heat of emotion rise, but swallowed it back down for the sake of being liked, being strong, being palatable. And yet, even now, it is offering you a path home. That tension in your jaw. It's not just stress. It's unspoken truth. That lump in your throat. It's not weakness. It's words that haven't yet found a voice. That ache in your back. Maybe it's grief without permission. The body keeps asking, gently, patiently, for you to stop pretending, to rest, to come back. To remember that the most important smile is not the one others see, but the one that emerges when no one is watching, when no one needs anything from you, when you are simply allowed to feel whatever is true. It's not easy. Pretending can feel safer. Numbness can feel quieter than pain. And performance often earns praise. But none of those things will make you feel whole. Only truth will, even if it's quiet. Even if it's messy, even if it comes with tears. So, tonight, ask yourself, softly with no pressure to answer right away, what have I been pretending not to feel? What mask have I worn for so long? I forgot it was even a mask. And can I, just for a few minutes, take it off? The world won't stop turning. You won't fall apart. What will happen is this. You'll breathe deeper. You'll feel more grounded. You'll remember what it's like to be a person, not just a role. And slowly, that soft unraveling will make space for something else. Not performance, not perfection, but presence. Your presence. The one that's been waiting. Not for judgment, not for applause, but for acknowledgement. And maybe, just maybe, that's when you'll find your first real smile again. The one that doesn't tighten your face. The one that doesn't feel like work. The one that rises from your chest like a remembered truth. The one that says, I'm here, and I don't need to be okay to be real. The eye contact that broke the spell in 2015, in a quiet psychology lab in Italy, researcher Giovanni Caputo designed an experiment that seemed almost too simple. He asked pairs of strangers to sit face to face, exactly 1 meter apart, and stare into each other's eyes, not for a moment, not while talking, but for 10 uninterrupted minutes. 10 minutes of silence. No conversation. No facial gestures. No escape into laughter or screens. Just gaze. Just presence. At first, participants found it awkward, even unbearable. Most people can't hold eye contact for longer than a few seconds, without shifting away, cracking a joke, or filling the space with noise. But in this experiment, silence was sacred, and in that silence, something strange began to unfold. Participants started to describe hallucinations, not wild or fantastical, but haunting distortions of reality. Faces began to morph. Some said the other person looked like an animal. Others saw someone entirely unfamiliar. A few saw flashes of their own face staring back at them. Time, they said, seemed to stretch, to vanish. It was as though the rules of perception had quietly unraveled. Caputo called this effect interpersonal dissociation. When the brain is deprived of language, motion, and distraction, it doesn't go blank. It starts to project. The silence doesn't stay empty. The mind fills it with stories, guesses, questions. Who is this person? Why are they looking at me this way? What are they thinking? What do they see in me? Am I being observed or exposed? It turns out eye contact is not just visual. It is deeply emotional. We often underestimate how powerful it is to be seen. Not glanced at, but truly seen. In conversation, we dart our eyes back and forth. We multitask. We protect ourselves. Because when we lock eyes for too long, something stirs. We feel naked, not in body, but in soul. Our defenses come up or fall down, and we don't always know which we want more. We live in a world where real attention is rare. We have become experts at avoiding presence. We check our phones while people talk. We look at screens more than we look at faces. We use words to fill silence, jokes to dodge sincerity, and gestures to soften truth. We smile even when we don't feel safe, and we nod when we don't agree. Why? Because real eye contact is not neutral. It's a kind of emotional X-ray. It sees beyond language. It strips away performance. Caputo's experiment wasn't dangerous. It wasn't even invasive. But it terrified many people. Why? Because it reminded them of what it feels like to be witnessed without a script, without armor, without roles. For many, it was the first time they sat in silence and were looked at not as a friend, employee, or relative, but simply as a person, not judged, not praised, just seen. It forced a question most of us rarely ask. What would happen if someone saw the real me? Not the version I prepare, not the one I polish for approval, but the quiet, unfiltered self underneath it all. Would they understand? Would they stay? Would I even recognize that version of me anymore? This fear isn't weakness. It's learned. We grow up being told to perform. From childhood, we learn what kind of face gets love, what kind of silence is tolerated, what kind of feelings are too big. And so, we adjust, we shrink, we present, we become so good at curating ourselves that when we are finally invited to be real, we panic because we've forgotten what real even looks like. We don't run from people. We run from the vulnerability that being fully seen demands. We fear that if someone looked too closely, they'd see the mess, the insecurity, the pain we've kept hidden. But here's the strange truth. Most people are just as afraid. They carry their own stories, their own masks, their own silent ache to be seen. We've built a culture of mutual performance, where everyone is pretending, not because they want to, but because they think they have to. But Caputo's study, strange as it was, offered something rare. A doorway back to presence, to truth, to raw, trembling humanity, not through speeches or therapy or confessions, just through the act of looking, just through holding still and letting the moment deepen. Imagine this. You sit across from someone, not to persuade them, not to charm them, not to analyze them, just to witness them. No filters, no commentary, just breath and presence. Their eyes become less like a wall and more like a mirror. You don't know what will appear. A memory, a longing, a softness, or something in yourself you thought you'd buried. We often say that love is built through action, and it is, but it also begins with attention. Real attention. The kind that doesn't look away when it gets uncomfortable. The kind that says, I see you and I'm still here. We rarely give that attention, even to ourselves, especially to ourselves. So if the idea of staring into another person's eyes feels too much, then begin smaller. Begin with your own. Go to the mirror, not to fix your hair, not to inspect a blemish, but to look, not to criticize, but to see. Who is this person behind your eyes? What story lives in their gaze? What emotion is hiding in their stillness? What did they lose when they learned to be likable? Hold the gaze, even when it trembles. Even when the urge to look away becomes unbearable, stay. Not because you're trying to prove anything, but because that self, that quiet, honest self, has waited a long time to be seen without judgment. You may start to feel strange, like you're looking at someone you don't quite recognize, or someone you've missed. The more you look, the more layers peel away. The bravado, the fatigue, the performative smile. Beneath all of it, something tender waits. Not perfect, not fixed, but real. We think looking is passive, but it's not. It's a kind of engagement, a kind of commitment. To meet someone's eyes is to say, I am here, I am with you, I am not afraid of your truth, or mine. This is why so many cultures treat eye contact as sacred. In some traditions, it is a form of prayer. In others, a ritual of healing. To lock eyes is to share something beyond words, something ancestral, something honest. So tonight, pause. Just pause. Not to achieve, not to impress, but to return. Return to yourself. Return to someone else. And ask the question that Caputo's experiment quietly suggested. What would happen if we stopped hiding? What would surface if we didn't fill the space? What might dissolve if we finally allowed ourselves to be seen? Fully, gently, without turning away. Maybe we'd find that the face across from us isn't so different. Maybe we'd realize we've both been waiting. Not for answers, but for acknowledgement. And maybe, just maybe, that's where healing begins. In the quiet, in the gaze, in the terrifying, beautiful act of being unhidden. The puzzle you were never meant to solve alone. What if all your doubts weren't evidence of failure, but signs of an experiment gone wrong? In the 1940s, psychologist Kurt Lewin, the father of social psychology, began asking questions that few dared to explore. What if behavior wasn't fixed inside a person, but shaped by the world surrounding them? What if people don't just act? They react to invisible forces in their environment. Lewin believed that to truly understand someone, you must understand the field they exist in, their relationships, their culture, their pressures, their limits. He designed a simple, yet powerful experiment with school children to test this. The groups were led by 3 types of leaders. Authoritarian leaders gave strict orders and expected obedience. Laissez-faire leaders gave almost no direction at all, and democratic leaders encouraged discussion and shared decision-making. The outcomes were startling. Children under authoritarian leaders got tasks done quickly, but grew anxious, hostile, and afraid when the authority figure wasn't present. The laissez-faire groups relaxed, but lost motivation and direction. But the democratic groups, they moved slower, but became more creative, more empathetic, and more resilient. Lewin's conclusion was quiet but revolutionary. The behavior we see in people is often a reflection of the system around them, not a failure within them. And yet, Decades later, most of us still look inward and blame ourselves. We say, I can't focus, or I'm not strong enough, or I don't belong. But what if the truth is that we've been dropped into environments never built for us in the first place? What if the classroom never accounted for your learning style? What if the job was designed around burnout and not balance? What if the family dynamic you were raised in confused fear for obedience and silence for safety? This is where systemic attribution error quietly creeps in. The tendency to believe that when things go wrong, the fault lies within us, not the design surrounding us. A student fails again and again and thinks they're stupid, without ever realizing they've never been taught in a way that resonates. An employee begins showing up late, believing they're unreliable, without ever acknowledging they're burnt out by unrelenting expectations. A person who can't stop overthinking doesn't question their upbringing, where chaos reigned and safety was never promised. Instead, they say, I'm just too sensitive. We live in a culture that glorifies self-help and idolizes personal responsibility. So when life feels unbearable, we don't look at the pressures. We look at ourselves. We dissect our habits, our weaknesses, our moods, never pausing to consider that we might simply be reacting to a system designed to suppress, not support. But you cannot fix in yourself what was broken around you. You cannot meditate your way out of an unsafe environment or hustle your way out of an exploitative job. Healing does not begin with blaming the mirror for the cracks in the glass. Kurt Lewin said that behavior is a function of both the person and their environment. It's not just who you are, it's where you are. And sometimes, what feels like personal failure is actually your nervous system reacting appropriately to consistent stress, instability, or invisibility. Imagine judging a flower for wilting when it was never given sunlight, or criticizing a fish for not climbing a tree. That's what systemic attribution does. It asks people to succeed in spaces never designed for them, and then blames them for not thriving. And yet, we push harder. We wake up earlier. We hustle longer. We stay quiet, try to be grateful, try to fix ourselves, thinking maybe this time it'll work. But all that ever changes is the shape of the mask we wear. We get praised for adapting, for coping, for managing, never realizing we're being rewarded for abandoning ourselves in systems that never saw us to begin with. So if you've been feeling exhausted, overwhelmed, unseen, pause. Not to try harder, but to reflect. What kind of system have you been surviving in? What kind of expectations have you internalized without questioning? What rules did you accept as truth that were never yours to begin with? The world is full of broken blueprints, family structures that mistake obedience for love, educational models that measure intelligence by memorization, workplaces that applaud overwork but punish rest. And when you don't fit into those designs, it's easy to believe you are the problem, but you're not. You are a truth the system didn't plan for. And that doesn't make you wrong. It makes you necessary. Tonight, if you feel like a puzzle with missing pieces, don't assume you were built wrong. Ask yourself, was I ever given all the pieces? Was I expected to solve this alone? Was the room I've lived in ever safe enough for me to grow? Because sometimes, healing doesn't begin with changing who you are. Sometimes, it starts with forgiving yourself for how long you survived inside a system that was never built for someone like you. You are not a failed experiment. You are evidence. Evidence that the structure must change. Evidence that survival is not weakness. Evidence that you still belong, even in spaces that forgot how to make room. And maybe, just maybe, the experiment needs to be rewritten. not you. The identity they gave you before you could speak. What if who you think you are was never fully your own idea? In the quiet moments, the in-between silences of your day, have you ever paused to wonder not just who you are, but how you became? Not in terms of job titles or personality quizzes, not your zodiac sign, or even the name on your birth certificate, but the deeper you, the part of you that narrates your day, that tells you what's worth trying, that whispers who you're allowed to be. That part didn't begin as a blank slate. It was formed, slowly, quietly, in rooms where you had little say, in your home, at school, at the dinner table, in the spaces where someone said your name and followed it with a label. She's the shy one. He's the funny one. She's the smart one. Just not like her sister. He's the strong one, the one who doesn't cry. These weren't just observations. They were assignments. Little scripts handed to you like costumes. And because you wanted love, or belonging, or safety, you put them on, and when someone said, "Look how responsible she is," you made sure to always be responsible, even when it hurt, even when you were tired, even when it wasn't fair, because the price of stepping out of character felt too high. This isn't a flaw, it's survival. Psychologist Erik Erikson, in the mid-20th century, studied how identity develops over time. He called it a lifelong process, shaped by crises, reflections, and transitions. He didn't mean crisis in the catastrophic sense. He meant those quiet internal collisions, where who you are bumps into who you were told to be. He called this stage identity versus role confusion. A fork in the road where you begin to wonder, who am I, really? But here's the twist. By the time we reach that crossroads, many of us have already been walking a path we never chose. We've become actors in a play someone else wrote. Teachers, parents, culture, religion, friends, all handing us lines, silently or directly. And somewhere along the way, we forget that we didn't write the script. You may think you chose your identity, but often we don't choose. We conform. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure, when you adopt a role without questioning alternatives. Not because you believe in it, but because you fear what might happen if you don't. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointing someone, fear of being too much or not enough, so you shrink, or perform, or smile through what hurts, because the show must go on. But what happens when the role you were given no longer fits, when you start to feel restless in your own skin, when the things that once made you proud now feel like chains? That's not a crisis. That's the beginning of truth. It doesn't mean you've lost your way. It means you're finally finding it. This unraveling is not destruction. It's an invitation to step off the stage, to drop the mask, to ask, maybe for the first time, who would I be if I wasn't trying to be someone else? The answer may not come all at once. It may feel like walking into a fog, because if you've been playing a part for years, you might confuse the costume for your skin. You might even grieve, not because you miss the old version of yourself, but because it's scary to let go of something that made you feel safe. But safety is not the same as truth. You were never meant to live inside someone else's imagination, even if they loved you, even if they meant well. Love that only allows you to be a certain version of yourself is not love. It's approval dressed as affection. And when we mistake approval for love, we stop growing. We get stuck in roles that feel tidy. Barred hollow, the peacemaker, the achiever, the quiet one, the caregiver, the overcomer. These identities sound noble, but they're only part of the picture. You're not just what made you useful to others. You're not just the thing you did that got applause. You're not just the coping mechanisms that helped you survive. You're more. And if you're feeling the ache of disconnection, if the mirror feels both familiar and foreign, that's not malfunction. That's awakening. You are not broken. You're becoming the version of yourself that's been waiting beneath the roles and expectations. And you don't need to tear everything down overnight. Start gently. Start with noticing. Notice when you say yes, but mean no. Notice when you laugh but feel empty. Notice when your compliments feel like currency and your achievements feel like a shield. Ask yourself, if I stopped performing, would anyone still love me? If I didn't succeed today, would I still be worthy? If I wasn't who they expect, would I still be me? These questions aren't easy, but they're necessary, because healing doesn't begin with answers. It begins with honesty. You don't need to rush toward a new identity. You don't need to announce your rebirth. You just need to make space for curiosity. Try asking, what parts of me feel alive? What makes me feel like I'm breathing? With my whole chest, what parts of me were never allowed to speak? And then, listen. Beneath the noise of conditioning, beneath the praise and pressure, beneath the roles you play so well, you almost forgot they were roles. There is a voice, yours. It may feel faint at first, like a whisper from a long-locked room, but it's still there. It always was. It's the part of you that never quite believed. The labels. That questioned why love had to be earned. That felt odd in rooms where everyone agreed. But you didn't, and that part, it's not rebellious, it's authentic. It doesn't want to burn everything down. It just wants to come home, to a name you choose, to a truth you define, to a self you don't have to twist into shape for others to accept. So tonight, if something in you is stirring, if your chest feels heavy with the weight of old expectations, if your inner world feels like it's stretching and cracking and rearranging, let it. This is not collapse. It's emergence. It means you're no longer living by default. You're choosing. You're awakening. You're stepping off the inherited path and carving one of your own. You don't need to know the destination yet. You just need to stop pretending you're not lost, because being lost is often the first step toward being real. So here's your permission. Not that you need it. You don't owe anyone the version of you they imagined. Not your parents. Not your partner. Not society. Not even the younger version of you who thought being liked was the same as being loved. You can choose again. You can rewrite the script. You can ask different questions. And most of all, you can name yourself. Not after what they called you, not after what they needed you to be, but after the parts of you that have waited patiently through the noise, the roles, the years. Because identity isn't about picking one label and wearing it forever. It's about meeting yourself over and over again and choosing to stay. The words you forgot were never yours. What if your inner voice belonged to someone else? In the quiet moments when the lights dim, when the noise dies down, and all that remains is the hush of your own mind. Have you ever listened, not just heard the thoughts flying by, but really listened to the voice inside your head, the narrator of your story, the one who speaks not in shouts, but in suggestions, not in full speeches, but in soft, familiar lines. Lines you know by heart. You always mess things up. You're too sensitive. You're not doing enough. You'll never get it right. You hear these words and think they're yours, but they're not. They are echoes, residue, inherited scripts, because long before we ever spoke to ourselves, someone else did. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades. It's called internalized speech. The private dialogue we carry within us, shaped not by who we are, but by what we've heard. We learn to talk to ourselves the way others talk to us. Our tone is borrowed, our phrasing mimicked, our beliefs rehearsed. If you were raised with love that felt like a transaction, if you behave, I'll hug you. If you succeed, I'll notice you. You may have learned to earn love instead of accept it. So now, even in solitude, your voice waits for proof before offering kindness. If your mistakes were met with anger or silence, your inner voice might now panic at every error, convinced that love disappears when you get things wrong. And if you were made invisible, not harmed, just unheard, you may now interrupt your own joy before anyone else gets the chance to. This voice becomes your constant companion. It sits beside you during job interviews. It follows you into relationships. It speaks up when you look in the mirror. Sometimes it even drowns out your actual voice until you don't know which thoughts are yours and which were planted. You call it instinct. You call it truth. But often, it's memory, disguised as certainty. And here's the most unnerving part. We trust that voice, even when it's cruel, even when it lies, because it sounds familiar. And we're wired to believe what feels familiar. But just because something feels true doesn't mean it is. Just because a voice has been in your head for years doesn't mean it belongs there. Think of your mind like a room. Would you let someone stand in the corner of that room and whisper cruel things to you every day? Would you allow a stranger to follow you around, criticizing your every move, judging your every thought, belittling every dream before it begins? No? Then why do we allow that voice to live rent-free in our most sacred space? Because we were taught to, not on purpose, not always out of malice, but because people passed down what they were given. A father who never said, "I'm proud of you," may have never heard it himself. A teacher who made you feel small might have been shrinking under the weight of their own wounds. This doesn't make the impact less real, but it helps us understand the voice inside you was built by people who didn't always know how to speak gently, and now you are the one repeating it. Not because you believe it deep down, but because no one ever told you you had permission to speak differently. But you do. You can change the voice. You can soften it. You can reteach it how to love. This process has a name: reparenting. It means becoming the parent, the guide, the nurturer you once needed. For yourself. It's not about blame. It's about responsibility. It's about choosing to end the cycle that made you feel unworthy. It starts quietly. The next time that harsh voice appears, pause. Notice it, not to fight it, not to argue, but to ask, whose voice is this? Where did I first hear this sentence? Would I say this to someone I love? And if the answer is no, then you don't have to say it to yourself. That's the shift. Not shouting over the voice, but replacing it. One gentle correction at a time. So instead of, "You're a failure," you whisper, "I'm still learning." Instead of, "No one will love me if I don't fix this," you murmur, "I am lovable, even when I'm messy." Instead of, "I'm too emotional," you remind yourself, "My feelings are valid. They help me understand the world." These rewrites may feel foreign at first, like trying on someone else's clothes. But over time, they soften. They start to fit. They begin to feel like home. And that's because you're not inventing something fake. You're returning to something real. The self that existed before the world told you who to be. You were not born with shame. You were taught it. You were not born thinking you had to earn love. You were conditioned to believe that. And now you are unlearning it. Word by word, thought by thought, kindness by kindness. Some people ask, isn't that just delusion, lying to yourself? No, it's healing, it's recovery, it's truth. finally told in your own voice. Imagine a child standing in front of you, scared, tired, unsure. Would you tell them they're worthless? That they'll never be enough? Of course not. So why do you say it to the version of you that still lives inside? The inner voice is not about delusion or denial, it's about choice. You can choose to carry the voice of your pain or the voice of your healing. You can let your inner voice be a critic or a coach, a jailer or a guide, a wound or a balm, because the truth is, you are not lazy. You are tired of carrying too much, too quietly. You are not broken. You are healing in a world that rarely gives you space to breathe. You are not too much. You are just unheld, unheard, unprotected, and you learn to grow louder than your pain. Tonight, in the quiet of your own mind, listen carefully, not to punish yourself, but to hear what needs rewriting, to trace each harsh word back to the moment it began, to ask, was that really me? Or was that someone else's fear, someone else's grief, masquerading as my truth? And then, begin to whisper something new. Start small. I am allowed to rest. I don't have to be perfect to be worthy. I can begin again, even now, because one day you'll notice something astonishing. You'll face a setback, and instead of panic, you'll hear compassion. You'll look in the mirror and see a softness that doesn't need to be earned. You'll find silence, and it won't feel lonely. It'll feel safe, because your voice, the one you rebuilt, word by word, will finally sound like home. And that voice, it won't haunt you. It will hold you. The mirror was watching you back. What if the way you move is shaped by who's watching? In the 1970s, psychologists Mark Zionk and Robert Wickland uncovered something subtle but profound, a concept called objective self-awareness. It's the quiet shift that happens inside us when we know or even think we're being watched. In their experiments, they didn't use cameras or observers. No one stared. No one spoke. All they did was place a mirror in a room. Just a mirror. And yet, it changed everything. Participants spoke more softly. They sat with better posture. They answered questions less selfishly. It was as if their reflection wasn't just showing their face. It was showing their conscience, their moral compass, their hidden standards. The mirror didn't demand anything. It simply reminded them of what they already carried within: values, expectations, and fears. And just like that, the presence of their own image summoned a different version of themselves, a more careful, curated version. But that's what's haunting. Sometimes we're not trying to impress the world. We're trying to impress the person we wish we were. And that performance, once repeated often enough, becomes habit. It becomes identity. We forget it's a mask. This raises an even deeper question. How much of what we do is shaped by who we truly are? And how much is shaped by the eyes we imagine watching us? Because every day we perform, not just on literal stages, but in hallways, grocery stores, Zoom calls, family dinners. We shift, we mold, we shrink, we exaggerate. We present versions of ourselves, depending on who we think might be paying attention, even when no one actually is. Sociologist Charles Horton Cooley called this the looking glass self. The idea that we build our identities, not from who we are, but from how we believe others perceive us. And often, those perceptions aren't even real. They're imagined. They're stitched from memories, past rejections, childhood experiences, stray comments, and cultural expectations. We walk through life in front of invisible mirrors, mirrors that were handed to us before we even understood what reflection meant. Mirrors built by shame, school systems, Instagram likes, generational silence. We adjust our tone in a meeting, not because we want to, but because we don't want to be too much. We delete the message, rewrite the caption, withhold the story, not because it wasn't true, but because it felt too vulnerable, too loud, too real. We laugh along when we're not amused. We nod when we disagree. We compliment when we ache. Over time, we become so used to these adjustments that we lose track of what was ever real. And then comes the quiet question. Who would you be if no one was watching? No audience, no camera, no mirror, no follower count, no childhood voice whispering, "Be careful. Who are you, unperformed?" Would your shoulders relax? Would your laugh change? Would you move differently in your own skin? Would you stop apologizing for taking up space? You might notice you prefer silence to small talk. You might realize you've never truly danced like no one's watching, because someone always was, or you thought they were. The truth is, most of us don't just fear judgment. We fear misalignment. That someone might see a version of us we didn't mean to show, the sad one, the soft one, the silly one, the strange one. So we tuck that version away. We feed the curated self. We nourish the acceptable one. And we forget that all of it, every mask, every mirror, was built for a world outside of us, not for the soul within. There's a cost to this performance. It's subtle, but heavy. It's the reason we feel exhausted after a simple conversation. It's why some spaces drain us, while others feel like air. Because pretending is tiring. Smiling when you're breaking is a full body workout. Matching the room when you're not in the mood is emotional labor. And sometimes, we mistake this fatigue for personality. We say, "I'm just quiet," or "I'm just anxious." When maybe, we're just carrying the weight of being watched. But there is a way back. It begins not with rebellion, but with stillness. It's in the moment you sit alone and the performance slips. Your shoulders drop, your breath deepens, your face unposed, and suddenly you're not performing. You're simply existing. There's no mirror here, just presence, just peace. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, you notice the quiet you, the version of you that hums softly in the background, waiting patiently beneath the noise. Not the projected self, not the praised self, just you. And in that stillness, you realize something deeply important. The mirror never defined you. It only showed the places where you'd learned to hide. It reflected the roles you were told to play, the standards you inherited, not the ones you chose. You were never the reflection. You were always the source, the light behind the mirror, the soul before the shape. And once you feel that, even just once, it changes you. You stop reaching for approval in rooms that were never safe. You stop shrinking for comfort. You stop mistaking attention for love. You start speaking even when your voice shakes. You begin remembering that your life is not a performance. It's not a brand. It's not a product to be polished. It's a breathing, evolving thing. And you, in all your unfiltered quietness, are enough. So tonight, rest your voice. You've been loud for long enough. Rest your posture. You've been holding too much. Let the soft parts of you unfold. Let the mask fall gently to the floor. Not in anger, but in relief. You no longer have to prove you belong. You do. You no longer have to earn your place. It's already yours. The world will still have mirrors. Some you can't avoid. Some you may even return to. But now you know, behind every reflection, there's something more real, something no eye can see, something that doesn't need to be seen to be valid, something that was never looking for an audience. You, still, soft, unwatched, alive. The label that sealed the door behind you. What if one word became your prison? Not a chain, not a cage, but a label. A word spoken once and never taken back. A word that doesn't describe you, but defines you. To others, then to yourself. In the 1970s, psychologist David Rosenhan conducted an experiment that would change the world's understanding of mental health. It was called On Being Sane in Insane Places. The setup was simple. 8 individuals, all psychologically healthy, checked themselves into psychiatric hospitals. They told the intake staff a single lie. I hear voices. That was it. No trauma, no breakdown, no erratic behavior. Just 3 vague words. Thud, empty, hollow. And for that, they were diagnosed with schizophrenia, admitted, observed, medicated. Then, something deeply unsettling happened. Once inside, they returned to normal. They behaved like themselves, spoke honestly, took notes for the study, asked when they could leave, but no one believed them. Because now, they were patients. Now, they were schizophrenic. Now, everything they did, even sanity itself, was filtered through that one word, writing in a journal, a sign of obsession, sitting alone, social withdrawal, saying, I'm fine, denial. The label rewrote every behavior, and the longer they stayed, the deeper that rewriting went. Even when they begged to be released, staff interpreted it as a symptom. They were trapped, not by walls, but by perception. This is what Rosenhan revealed. Once someone is labeled, especially with something heavy, we stop seeing them. We only see the label. We look for evidence to confirm what we already believe, and we ignore anything that contradicts it. It's called confirmation bias, a trick of the mind, a flaw in how we perceive truth. And it doesn't just happen in hospitals. It happens in homes, in schools, in workplaces, in families. That kid is trouble. She's too emotional. He's manipulative. They're lazy. These are not observations. They're verdicts, stamped on someone's identity, often permanently. And over time, something even more damaging occurs. The label is internalized. We stop explaining ourselves. We stop defending who we are. We stop trying. Because when your truth is constantly dismissed, you begin to wonder if it's worth telling it all. You say, if I'm going to be misunderstood anyway, why bother? And that's how the prison is built. Not from cruelty, but from repetition, from the slow erosion of being seen as a full person, and the steady shrinking into a single story. This is not just about mental health. This is about identity, about the quiet, invisible boxes we place around each other and ourselves. Think of the child constantly told they're bad, the teen labeled attention-seeking, the woman called too much, the man told you're weak. These words stick, not because they're true, but because they're repeated, and repetition feels like reality. Eventually we play the part, not out of authenticity, but out of exhaustion. It becomes easier to fulfill the role than to fight it. We become what we're told we are, even if it suffocates us. But here's what Rosenhan's experiment also reminds us. Labels are not always wrong. Mental illness is real. Diagnosis can be clarifying, helpful, healing. But there is a difference between using a label for support and weaponizing it for control. There is a difference between understanding someone and reducing them. Because when we mistake a label for a life sentence, we steal the possibility of growth, of change, of becoming. A diagnosis is not a definition. An identity is not a cage. Yet that's what we do. We flatten people into categories: introvert, narcissist, failure, burden, as if one word could ever explain a whole life. And sometimes the most painful label isn't the one others give you. It's the one you give yourself. I'm broken. I'm difficult. I'm unlovable. Where did you first hear that? Whose voice wrote it into your story? And how long have you carried it? Because here's what's often true. By the time you realize the label is wrong, you've already built a whole life around it. You've dimmed yourself, denied yourself, defined yourself through other people's limited vision. But there is another way, another truth. You are not your label. You never were. You are the moments no one sees, the choices no one asks about, the resilience no one gives you credit for. You are allowed to be more than one thing. You are allowed to grow beyond what people expected. You are allowed to change your story, even if it makes others uncomfortable, because healing is not linear and identity is not static. You can carry a diagnosis and still be joyful, still be creative, still be complex, still be whole. You can have made mistakes and still be worthy of forgiveness. You can be misunderstood and still be honest. You can outgrow the words they use to define you. And if tonight there is a word that feels too heavy, a label someone gave you that no longer fits, a role you never agreed to, let it loosen, let it breathe, let it peel off. Say your name beneath it, the real one, the one that existed before they told you who you were supposed to be. You are not too much. You are not broken. You are not just like your father. You are not a disappointment. You are still becoming, and becoming is messy. It's non-linear. It doesn't always make sense to others, but it's yours, and no one gets to rewrite your story without your permission. So if a label became your prison, remember, a prison can be opened, a sentence can be revised, a name can be reclaimed. You don't need permission. You need remembrance. You hold the key, not because someone gave it to you, but because it was never taken from you. You just forgot where you left it. So tonight, go find it. Go back to the moment before they told you who to be. Back to the version of you that was still curious, still open, still real. Back to the truth that no word can contain a human being. No diagnosis can describe a soul, and no label is stronger than the quiet power of choosing your own voice. The mask that grew a face. What if pretending for too long makes you forget you're pretending? At first, it's just a habit, a reflex, a coping strategy. You walk into the room and straighten your shoulders. You smile because it's expected. You nod even when you disagree. You say, "I'm fine," not because it's true, but because anything more would require energy you don't have, or attention you don't want, and it works. People praise you. You're so strong, so mature, so positive. You get through the day, you function, you succeed, but deep beneath that praise, something begins to shift. A quiet erosion, a drift. One day you wake up and realize you can't remember the last time you felt truly seen. In the 1970s, psychologist Philip Zimbardo, the man behind the Stanford prison experiment, coined a chilling term, the Lucifer effect. The idea that good people can become unrecognizable under the weight of powerful roles and environments. But what if the environment isn't a prison? What if it's a family, a workplace, a friend group? What if it's your own life? Curated, filtered, optimized. What if the costume isn't for a role you play once, but one you wear every single day? We all wear masks. The polite smile at dinner, the competent tone in a meeting, the upbeat laugh when you're breaking inside, the calm voice when you're screaming silently for someone to notice. And at first, that mask feels like protection. It buys you space. It keeps you safe. It helps you survive the expectations, the pressure, the judgments. But the problem isn't wearing the mask. It's when the mask starts to wear you. Over time, it hardens. It becomes easier to play the role than to feel. You forget what your face looks like underneath. You forget what it means to speak without performing, to be without editing. Psychologists call this self-presentation theory. The idea that we shape our behavior and identity to gain approval, love, belonging, and it works until it doesn't. Until you realize you haven't cried in years. Not because you're healed, but because you've forgotten how to feel. Until the laugh you use in conversations starts to echo hollow in your ears. Until every compliment feels like it belongs to someone else. Some version of you that people think they know. And the person staring back in the mirror. She feels like a project. He feels like a performance. Something to manage, not someone to love. This is the danger of the long performance self. Not that it's fake, but that it's exhausting. It drains you slowly, quietly, convincingly. You begin to live on autopilot. You smile without warmth. You agree without conviction. You exist, but you're not sure you're really living. And still, you keep going. Because breaking character feels dangerous, too vulnerable, too unknown. Maybe you were taught to always be strong, to never be a burden, to make others comfortable, even when you're falling apart. Maybe you learned that being real cost you love once, and you promised yourself, never again. So you became the fixer, the helper, the achiever, the peacemaker, roles that earned love, even if they cost you yourself. But here's the part we don't talk about enough. Pretending isn't sustainable. It may earn applause, but it won't give you rest. It may bring success, but it won't bring you home to yourself. Because underneath every mask is a truth trying to breathe. And here's where Zimbardo's work comes full circle. Even the darkest roles are reversible. Even the deepest performance can be paused. It begins with something radical, a pause, a breath, a quiet moment where you let the mask slip. Even for a second, it begins when you whisper something you've been too afraid to say. I'm not okay. I'm tired. I don't want to be this version anymore. I don't remember who I am when no one's watching. That's not weakness. That's a beginning. Because contrary to what we're taught, authenticity doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's the softest voice in the room that tells the greatest truth. So tonight, let the performance end, just for now. No applause, no audience, no need to entertain, just you, with the door closed, with your shoulders dropped, with no script to follow. Who are you? Without the smile, without the posture, without the perfectly managed tone. Who are you? When you stop pretending you're fine, you might find tears. You might find laughter. You might find silence so still it scares you. But beneath all of it, you'll find you, and you were never the mask. You were the one buried underneath it, waiting patiently for the role to end. You were never the curated version. You were never the polished bio. You were never the everything's good reply. You are not your LinkedIn summary, not your filtered Instagram life, not the person who always holds it together. You are messy, tender, changing, complicated, alive. And that's what's real. So let the mask slip, not all at once, just enough to breathe. Let the smile fade when it wants to. Let the tears come if they need to. Let the laughter be honest, even if it's rare. Let your face be seen by yourself again, not as a role, not as a task, not as a thing to fix, but as someone who's finally allowed to be. Because the truth is this, you are not too lost to return. You are not too far gone to remember. You are not too practiced to relearn how to feel. And even if you've worn the mask for years, even if it feels like your real face, you can still take it off. It's never too late to be real, not perfect, not polished, just honest. And in a world that keeps asking you to perform, your honesty, your softness, your rawness is the most radical thing you can offer. You don't need to be inspiring. You don't need to be impressive. You just need to be you, the version that feels, that breaks, that needs, that loves without editing. So tonight, put down the script, walk off the stage, take off the mask, even if just for a moment, and meet the version of you who's been waiting in the wings, not the perfect one, the real one. And when you do, you'll realize something powerful. You are what remains when pretending stops, and that is enough. The silence that became your first language. What if the reason you don't speak is because you were taught not to be heard, not with words, not with anger, not even with tears? In trauma psychology, there's a term not often discussed outside, clinical walls, but it lives in the bones of those who carry it. Pre-verbal wounding. It doesn't begin with a scream. It begins before the scream, before there was even the capacity to make one, before language, before memory, before you could defend yourself, or even know there was something to defend against. Pre-verbal trauma is the kind that happens so early, so silently, that it never enters your timeline in the form of a story. It enters your nervous system as a rule about the world, a rule about your worth, a rule about what happens when you reach out. You see, babies don't need vocabulary to feel. They read tone, they absorb mood, they sense distance, they notice absence, they memorize indifference, they learn what it means when the air tenses up, when footsteps approach and warmth doesn't follow, when a need is met with a delay, or with disapproval, when hunger isn't the only thing that goes unfed. And so the body learns, not with logic, but with pattern. If I cry, nothing comes. If I reach, no one holds. If I laugh too loud, they go away. If I scream, I am scolded. If I exist too much, they retreat. Over time, silence becomes safer than sound. Stillness becomes safer than asking. Invisibility becomes safer than being seen. And this is not a choice. This is survival. It begins as a reflex and becomes a role. The quiet child, the good girl, the easy son, the one who never needs too much, who doesn't ask questions, who doesn't throw tantrums, who doesn't cry in a way that requires someone to stay, not shy, not introverted, not peaceful, but scarred. In a language no one taught you to speak, this is what it means to carry pre-verbal wounds, to walk into adulthood armored with politeness, but haunted by hunger, emotional hunger, connection hunger, the kind of hunger that doesn't show on your face, but lives in the pauses of your voice. You laugh when things aren't funny. You apologize for being in the room. You wait for permission to feel, to speak, to need. You flinch not from pain, but from kindness. You don't trust what's offered freely. You hold your breath when someone looks at you for too long, because somewhere deep inside, a story is still running. Being seen is not safe. This is not drama. This is not overreaction. This is neurobiology. Psychologists and neuroscientists now understand that pre-verbal trauma is not stored in memory. It's stored in muscle, in breath, in heart rate, in digestion, in posture. It's in the way your shoulders curl to protect, your chest, the way your stomach tightens when someone calls your name, the way your voice catches when you try to say what you really want. It's not that you don't remember. It's that you never got the words in the first place. And here's the most haunting truth of all. When no one reflects you back with warmth, when your cries echo into emptiness, when your joy is ignored and your sadness is too loud for others to tolerate, you learn to disappear, not all at once, but slowly. You stop telling stories, you stop asking questions, you stop crying in public, then in private, then not at all. You don't forget how to speak. You forget that you were allowed to, and so silence becomes your mother tongue. Not just silence around others, but silence inside yourself. You don't just stop speaking, you stop listening to your own pain. You tell yourself, it wasn't that bad. They did their best. I turned out fine. But that's not healing. That's adaptation. Healing is different. Healing begins, sometimes, not with language, but with sound. A sigh, a sob, a breath you didn't know you were holding, a name whispered in therapy for the first time. Your name, spoken with kindness, not command. These are the first cracks in the wall. And then something incredible happens. The silence, once sacred, begins to loosen. One sentence escapes, then another. And suddenly, you hear yourself say things you didn't know were inside. I'm tired. I need help. I don't want to go. I was hurt. This is not just emotional progress. This is reprogramming. Because every time you name a need, every time you tell the truth, you rewrite a nervous system that was wired to hide. You don't just change your story, you change your biology, and that's where the healing begins. In the micro moments, in the first time you say no and survive, in the first time you cry and no one leaves, in the first time you ask for something and get it without punishment. It's terrifying. It feels like breaking a law, but what you're breaking is a pattern that was never yours to begin with. You were not born to be silent. You were silenced. There's a difference. And now you get to choose again. So if tonight you find yourself alone and silence is the only thing that feels familiar, know that you're not broken. You're not behind. You're not dramatic. You're not invisible. You are learning a new language. One made of courage, of reclaiming, of truth. You are not too much. You are not too late. You are not too loud for the right people. And you are not unworthy of being heard, because your first language was silence. But your second can be truth. And truth, no matter how quiet at first, is the loudest kind of freedom. So speak, even if it trembles. Speak. Even if your voice cracks, speak, not to be understood by others, but to remember what it feels like to understand yourself. And if no one ever told you this before, I will. You don't have to disappear to be loved. You don't have to be small to be safe. You don't have to stay silent to belong. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be heard. You are allowed to exist. In full volume. Let the silence end where your voice begins. What if reality can be edited with just a whisper of doubt? What if reality isn't shattered all at once, but slowly edited? Not with violence, not with proof, but with a whisper, a raised eyebrow, a sigh, a carefully timed silence. In the 1950s, long before the term gaslighting entered our everyday language, psychologists began to uncover something both fascinating and terrifying, that our perception of reality could be altered, not by force, but by suggestion. One experiment was simple. Participants were shown two lines, one straight, one clearly, obviously crooked. The task was to identify the correct one, the straight one, simple, obvious, clear. But then came the twist. Unbeknownst to the real participant, everyone else in the room was a Confederate, an actor in on the experiment, and one by one, they confidently chose the wrong line. They all pointed to the crooked one, smiling, certain, united. The real participant looked around, hesitated, checked again. The truth hadn't changed. The line was still, crooked, but their confidence had, and slowly, nervously, they agreed with the group, not because their eyes had failed, but because their certainty had been stolen. This is the essence of gaslighting. It is not just a lie. It is an erosion, a slow war on the trust you place in your own perception. And it doesn't just happen in romantic relationships. It happens in families, where memory becomes a battlefield, in institutions, where rules are bent and then blamed on you, in cultures, where systemic harm is reframed as individual failure. It happens quietly, cleverly, and most often, repeatedly. Gaslighting doesn't tell you the truth is false. It just makes you ask, again and again, am I overreacting? Did I misunderstand? Maybe it really is my fault, and that word, maybe, becomes your mirror. Every time you look at your past, your memory, your truth, that maybe fogs the glass. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I read it wrong. Maybe I made it all up. Eventually you stop looking altogether. You stop trusting your instincts. You start outsourcing your reality to the people who benefit most from rewriting it. Because here's the quiet trick of gaslighting. It doesn't erase the truth. It just asks you to doubt it enough times until doubt becomes the only truth you recognize and the damage it leaves behind. It has a name: epistemic trauma. The trauma of being made to distrust your own mind. The injury of having your knowingness, your internal compass, cracked. It's not just emotional. It's cognitive. It's existential. It's the child who says, but I remember that happening, and here's, you have such an imagination. It's the partner who says, you said that last night, and here's back, I never said that. You must be tired. It's the employee who sets boundaries, and then gets subtly excluded from the next project, but praised in public, so they're never quite sure what went wrong. It's being told that you're too emotional, that your pain is drama, that your story isn't real unless someone else agrees with it. Over time, this chips away at the most sacred thing you have: your ability to believe yourself. And what follows isn't just confusion, it's self-abandonment. You stop checking in with your gut. You stop listening to your body. You stop trusting the heat in your chest when something feels wrong. Because if your mind can be doubted, what's left to anchor you? And this is what makes gaslighting so dangerous, so invisible, so hard to name, because its goal is not just to distort reality. It's to convince you to do it for them. The abuser doesn't need to control you forever. They just need to train you to question yourself, to hesitate before you speak, to reword your truth before you say it out loud, to flinch, not from them, but from your own memory. And the worst part, healing from this kind of manipulation isn't as simple as walking away, because you're not just rebuilding relationships. You're rebuilding reality. You're unlearning the habit of minimizing yourself. You're rewriting the rules of what counts as real. You're learning to hear your voice again and not immediately correct it. And at first, it feels wrong, not because it is wrong, but because the betrayal you experienced taught you to survive through silence. To speak your truth now feels like betrayal of them. Of the version of you that played along, of the story you needed to believe just to make it through. But then, there's a moment, maybe small, maybe sudden, maybe after a dream, maybe while brushing your teeth. You hear it, a whisper not of doubt, but of certainty. No, that did happen. That was real. I was not wrong. I was not too much. I did deserve better. And in that moment, something sacred begins to shift. The spell, the fog, begins to lift. Not completely, not forever, but enough to take one brave step toward yourself. And that first step, that first moment of clarity, it feels like rebellion. It feels like standing up in a room full of people, pointing at the crooked line and saying, "No, that's not right. I see the truth. I trust my eyes." It might not win you applause, but it will begin to win you back, because clarity, after confusion, feels like a risk. But it is not a threat. It is freedom. So tonight, if your memory feels soft around the edges, if your instincts feel muted, if the truth feels dangerous instead of grounding, I want you to hold something close. You are not broken. You are not weak. You were not imagining it. You were confused on purpose. You were doubted by design. You were trained to mistrust yourself so that someone else could be more comfortable. But your clarity, even if it arrives in fragments, is still yours. And it's returning, not in shouts, but in soft, steady whispers. One brave belief at a time. You are not crazy. You are remembering. You are not overreacting. You are resurfacing. You are not too much. You are simply always enough. In a system, in a family, in a relationship that told you shrinking was safer, but no more shrinking. Tonight, your knowing is your medicine. Your memory is your map and your story. It doesn't need to be approved. It just needs to be honored. You don't owe anyone your confusion. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't have to bend the truth to make them comfortable anymore. You are allowed to remember clearly. You are allowed to name what happened. You are allowed to say, that was gaslighting. That was manipulation. That was real. And you are still here, clearer than ever, and worthy of peace, always. The smile that covered 1,000 wounds. What if the person who seems the strongest is the one who was never allowed to fall? In trauma psychology, there's a pattern that whispers behind every high achiever's smile. A quiet, consistent survival strategy we call the high-functioning survivor. They are the ones who always have it together, who anticipate what's needed before anyone even asks, who stay calm in chaos, speak with clarity, plan with precision, and never seem to need anything themselves. They are praised endlessly. You're so strong. You've got it all figured out. You're so responsible. But behind closed doors, when the day quiets and there's no one left to help, they are not okay. They are not resting. They are not thriving. They are surviving, quietly, beautifully, and utterly alone. This is not resilience. This is adaptation, a skill honed in early environments where vulnerability was punished, not nurtured, where being needy made you a burden, and being useful, being helpful, was the only path to connection. Psychologist Janina Fisher names this survival mechanism trauma-linked competence, a hidden wound that often looks like success. These are the children who grew up too fast, who became the mediator in a home of chaos, who cooked dinner while their parents argued, who held their crying sibling and whispered, "It's okay, I've got you," all while wondering who would ever say the same to them. They are the ones who got straight A's, not because they were ambitious, but because failure meant being forgotten. They cleaned their rooms obsessively, not out of discipline, but because chaos outside demanded control inside. They became experts at not needing anyone, because needing felt dangerous. These people, now adults, show up early. They answer the call. They carry the weight. They become doctors, teachers, leaders, caregivers. They are the friend who never cancels, the sibling who always shows up, the colleague who picks up the slack, and still, they feel like they're not doing enough. Because deep down, their worth became tied to their usefulness. To stop even for a moment, feels like risking everything. Rest feels like laziness. Asking for help feels like betrayal. Crying feels like weakness. And stillness, terrifying. They don't know how to fall, because no one ever caught them. They have been applauded for their composure, rewarded for their strength, revered for their dependability. But what goes unseen is the chronic fatigue behind their eyes, the ache in their jaw from clenching through disappointment, the nights they lie awake, wondering if anyone would notice if they disappeared. Because when your role is the strong one, people stop asking if you're okay. They assume you've got it covered. They lean on you because that's what you've always allowed. And slowly, over years or even decades, you forget what it feels like to be the one held. You don't know how to receive. You don't know how to let go. You don't even know what you need because you were never taught to look inward. And when that day comes, when your body shuts down, when you burst into tears for no reason, when your chest feels tight and your breath shallow, you blame yourself. I shouldn't feel like this. I should be stronger. I don't have time to break. But the truth is, you were never meant to carry this much. Responsibility became your armor. Excellence became your hiding place. Smiling became your survival strategy. And the saddest part, every time someone applauded your strength, without seeing your softness, without asking about your sorrow, they unknowingly confirmed what your younger self feared all along, that you are only lovable when you're useful, only worthy when you're holding it all together, only safe when you're suppressing your pain. But that's not the truth, because strength is not the absence of struggle. It's not perfection. It's not endless giving. True strength is knowing when to pause. True strength is allowing yourself to exhale. True strength is saying, I can't do this alone anymore. And that kind of strength, it scares the high-functioning survivor because it demands honesty. It demands softness. It demands stepping out of the role they were forced to play for so long. It asks them to believe, deeply, that love is not earned by performance, that they are worthy even when they are quiet, even when they are broken, even when they are resting. So tonight, if you are the one who always holds everyone else up, I want you to know something sacred. You do not have to prove your worth, not to anyone, not anymore. You don't have to be the hero. You don't have to be invincible. You don't have to say, I'm fine, when your soul is begging for someone to ask twice. Let yourself lean back, even if it feels strange, even if it makes you cry, even if it takes practice. Because leaning doesn't mean collapsing. It means trusting that someone might actually care. It means choosing softness over silence. It means choosing you. And if the tears come, let them. Your tears do not make you less admirable. They make you real. And real is always, always worthy of love. You don't need to carry everyone. You don't need to smile through it. You don't need to keep earning the right to exist. You've already earned it by simply being here, by surviving what others never saw, by showing up again and again, even when your heart was tired. Let someone show up for you. Let someone listen. Let someone hold your hand, not because they need you, but because they see you. And if no one else ever told you, you're allowed to fall. You're allowed to stop. You're allowed to just be. Because you are not loved for how much you can give. You are loved because you exist. That is enough. That has always been enough. The boundary that was never yours to draw. What if the people closest to you never truly saw you? Not because they hated you, not because they wanted to hurt you, but because they were too lost in their own world to witness yours. In developmental psychology, there's a quiet tragedy known as mirroring failure. It doesn't leave bruises. It doesn't yell. It doesn't storm out the door or break furniture. It simply isn't there. It happens in the stillness, the silence, the overlooked moments. When a child reaches out with a drawing, eyes wide, heart open, and hears, "That's nice," without a glance. When a child stumbles, cries, looks for comfort, and finds no outstretched arms, only a distracted face behind a glowing screen or a locked bedroom door. When they laugh, full, radiant, and no one mirrors it back. No smile, no shared joy, just emptiness. Over time, this absence becomes louder than any scolding voice, because children don't just want attention. They need reflection. They're born with no solid sense of self. Their identity builds like scaffolding. From the outside in, they look to their caregivers for evidence of who they are. Do I matter? Am I delightful? Is my sadness too much? Is my joy allowed? In healthy mirroring, a child's smile is returned. Their tears are named. Their presence is confirmed. But when that doesn't happen, when joy is met with indifference, when fear is left unexplored, the child receives a quieter message. Your emotions confuse me. Your needs inconvenience me. Who you are doesn't register, and in the absence of mirroring, something internal begins to dim. Not all at once, but gradually, like a light flickering in a room, no one enters anymore. The child may grow up performing emotions instead of feeling them, smiling when they're scared, laughing when they're uncomfortable, shrinking when they're supposed to take up space. They begin to build their identity around what gets a reaction, not what's real. You might know someone like this. You might be someone like this. The person who always asks others how they are, but freezes when the question is returned. The one who nods politely, even when hurt, cracks a joke instead of crying, changes their tone depending on the room. The one who walks away from a conversation wondering, did they actually see me? Or just the version I crafted? It's not manipulation, it's adaptation. Because for many, the absence of authentic mirroring wasn't just disappointing. It was dangerous. If you cried too much, you were dramatic. If you were too quiet, you were moody. If you asked for reassurance, you were needy. And so you learned to adjust. Not just your words, but your entire emotional palette. You tuned yourself like an instrument, playing only the notes others found tolerable. Eventually you forgot what your true song even sounded like. But here's the heartbreak. What was missing wasn't your fault. It never was. The mirror that failed to reflect you, your parent, your caregiver, your teacher, was cracked long before you ever stood in front of it. They too might have been unseen. They too may have been carrying generations of unmirrored pain. This isn't about blame, it's about truth. Because healing doesn't begin with fixing the past. It begins with naming it. You were not difficult. You were not too emotional. You were not a problem that needed silencing. You were a person becoming. And no one met you there. And now you get to meet yourself, to become the mirror you always needed. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually with grace. It starts with pausing, even for 10 seconds, when a wave of emotion rises, not to judge it, not to change it, but to say, I see you. When you feel sadness, don't stuff it. Hold it. Let it breathe. Say, you're allowed. When joy flickers, even in small ways, let it bloom. Don't cut it short to appear humble. Don't hide it behind a joke. Just let it be. And when fear visits, because it will, don't excommunicate it. Invite it closer. Say, I know you're here. I know why. Let's sit. This is mirroring from the inside. It's what happens when you learn to reflect yourself. After years of being distorted or ignored, You begin to notice things, that you have preferences, not just inherited ones, that you feel anger, not just irritation buried in politeness, that you need, and that this need is not shameful, but human. It's not easy. Sometimes you'll hear the voices of the old mirrors echo back, "You're being selfish. Why are you making such a big deal? You're too sensitive." But now you get to ask a different question. Whose voice is that? And do I still want to believe it? You get to pause in that moment and place your hand on your chest. Not for comfort, but for reconnection. Because the reflection doesn't live in others anymore. It lives in you. Tonight, if you find yourself wondering why it's so hard to trust your feelings, if you second-guess your needs before you even speak them, if you feel like you disappear the moment someone else enters the room, it's not because you're broken, it's because you spent years being half-reflected, or not reflected at all. And now you're learning to step back into the mirror, fully, unfiltered, unperformed, unapologetic, even if no one else is watching, because some of the most powerful healing happens in private, in rooms with no applause, in late-night tears no one sees, in moments where you say to yourself, "I matter, even when I'm alone." This is the sacred return to authenticity, to self-trust, to the emotional presence you were once denied. And as you mirror yourself, something shifts outward too. You begin to recognize who truly sees you, not for who you pretend to be, but for who you are without effort. You stop chasing validation from those who only love your silence. You stop shape-shifting in rooms that demand smallness. You stop confusing invisibility with peace. Instead, you start drawing boundaries, not as a punishment, but as a reintroduction. This is me. This is how I feel. This is the space I take up, and I'm allowed to take it. You begin to trust relationships that grow with your truth, not those that survive on your suppression. And yes, some connections will fade. Some people were only attached to the version of you that dimmed your own light. Let them go, because the mirror you build now will attract those who see clearly. People who reflect your joy without stealing it, who echo your sadness without silencing it, who hold your complexity without trying to flatten it into something easier. So tonight, if the silence in your heart feels sharp, if the emptiness of unmirrored years still echoes, pause, not to judge, not to fix, but to witness. You are not invisible. You are simply waiting to be seen. And now, the one who sees you is you, and that is enough to begin again. What happens when we are told not to feel what we feel? What happens when we're told not to feel what we feel? At first, maybe nothing. Maybe we just blink. Maybe we nod. Maybe we pretend to understand. Because when you're young, when you're still learning how to translate your inner world into words, and someone tells you you're overreacting, or that didn't hurt, or you're being too sensitive, something quiet begins to unravel. You stop trusting your own body's signals. You learn to doubt your own tears. You begin to believe that what you're feeling must be wrong, not because it feels wrong, but because someone else said it was. This isn't just a parenting issue. It's not just about childhood. It's a pattern we absorb and carry into every corner of our lives, relationships, workplaces, politics, and even the way we talk to ourselves. But let's go back to the beginning. In the early 1960s, psychologist Albert Bandura conducted an experiment now known as the Bobo doll study, one of the most quietly haunting studies in psychology. Here's what happened. Children were shown films of adults interacting with a blow-up doll named Bobo, a clown figure with a red nose and wide painted smile, designed to spring back up when knocked down. In some films, the adults played calmly, treating the doll like a toy, a companion. In others, the adults turned violent. They hit, punched, kicked, and shouted at the doll with words like stupid and take that, and the children, they watched, absorbed. Then they were left alone in a room with the same doll. The results? Eerily predictable. The children who watched violence mimicked it, not just roughly, but exactly. They used the same words, the same motions. Some even picked up toy weapons and amplified the aggression, not because they were cruel, not because something inside them was broken, but because they had learned that this was acceptable, this was allowed, this was behavior that in their minds came without consequence. And here's the part that unsettles researchers to this day. Some of the children laughed. They laughed as they hit the doll, laughed as they knocked it over, but not because they enjoyed cruelty, because they were confused. They had just seen something jarring, something dissonant. An adult who they believed was supposed to protect and model care, instead modeling violence. So what happens in a child's mind when kindness is absent and pain is brushed off as entertainment? Empathy doesn't vanish. It goes dormant. It steps back. It watches. This experiment became more than a study. It became a metaphor. Mirror. Because the truth is, most of us are still living inside that experiment. Not with dolls, not with film reels, but in homes where affection is conditional. Given when we succeed, withheld when we're vulnerable. In schools where bullying is dismissed as kids being kids. In workplaces where humiliation is called feedback, where overwork is called dedication, and where people compete to feel worthy. In cultures where dominance is rewarded, where the loudest voice gets the mic, where pain is privatized, where public strength matters more than inner truth, and slowly, silently, we begin to adapt. We flinch less at cruelty. We stop questioning indifference. We start telling ourselves stories like, that's just the way life is. You need to toughen up. Don't let it get to you. But what is the cost of numbing? What happens when we keep shrinking our capacity to feel? For others, and eventually for ourselves. Something subtle happens first. We get tired, not the kind of tired that sleep can fix, but the kind that builds behind the eyes. A weariness that comes from holding too much in, smiling when we're aching, laughing when we're confused, apologizing for our own sadness. Then something colder follows. Detachment. The stories that used to move us now feel distant. The suffering we see on the news, background noise, even our own emotions, muted. Like a song we once knew the words to, now playing in another room. But here's the miracle of the human mind. Empathy doesn't die. It hides. It waits. It shelters itself beneath the armor we had to wear to survive. The masks we had to put on to be accepted. The silence we learned to keep because we feared the cost of speaking up. And even in the quietest person, the most hardened face, that seed of care still lives. It just needs permission, not pressure, not guilt. Permission to feel again, to flinch again, to cry. Not because we're weak, but because we've finally stopped pretending. And here's the beauty. Modeling compassion doesn't require a PhD, a perfect past, or a platform. It requires only presence. When someone shares their pain and we don't rush to fix it. When a child cries and we say, "That must have been scary," instead of "Stop crying." When we admit we're hurting and let someone hold that truth without rushing us out of it. This is how empathy returns. Not in grand gestures, but in micro moments. In slowing down instead of speeding past. In choosing curiosity over judgment. In saying, "I don't understand yet, but I want to," Because feeling isn't just an individual act, it's relational. We learn what's safe to feel based on what the people around us show they can hold. So if you grew up in a world where feelings were too much, where anger was punished, where softness was mocked, if you learned to smile through heartbreak, to numb through noise, to disappear emotionally just to stay physically safe, please know you are not broken. You adapted brilliantly, and your empathy, your full, aching, beautiful capacity to care, is still within you, just waiting to be welcomed back. Tonight, if you've felt numb lately, if other people's suffering feels too far away, if even your own pain feels too small to say aloud, you're not alone. This is what happens when we live in a world that rewards productivity over presence, performance over authenticity. But you can begin again with one breath, with one moment of noticing, that tug in your chest when someone's voice cracks, that lump in your throat when a memory returns, that warmth in your eyes when kindness finds you unexpectedly. That's not weakness, that's you, the you that existed long before the world taught you to hide. The you that felt freely, loved loudly, cried without shame, and no, we don't get that innocence back, exactly as it was, but we get something wiser, a choice, to feel with awareness, to care with boundaries, to connect with courage, and to say, not just with our words, but with our presence, I see you, I feel you, you matter, because the world doesn't need more armored people. It needs softer ones who remember how to hold pain gently. It needs people who know that numbness is not peace and silence is not strength. It needs people who dare to feel even when it hurts. So if you're listening to this with a clenched jaw or tired eyes or a heart that's been waiting for permission to soften, let this be it. Let this be the quiet homecoming for the parts of you that learn to disappear, because you're not here to be hard. You're here to remember. That tenderness is not the enemy of resilience. It's the soil from which real strength grows. And in a world that taught you to fear your own softness, the bravest thing you can do is feel anyway. Welcome back. Welcome home.